Tonight, if you'd like, let the room grow a little quieter, and I'll place a small lantern on the table between us, a soft pool of light where the past can sit without feeling examined, and we'll breathe our way into a world most people only meet as a silhouette: the ninjas. You've seen the posters and the movie masks and the tidy black that swallows a whole alley, but the story you're about to hear is slower, more human, and far more interesting. It begins in fog-drawn valleys and cedar-scented towns where survival learned good manners, mountain monks who could read the weather inside their lungs, midwives who knew the schedules of panic and mercy, carpenters who taught ropes to have second careers. In those valleys, techniques did not arrive with trumpets. They gathered like household habits. How to place your sandals so an emergency doesn't waste a second. How to carry a tray so it can fall convincingly when necessity needs a distraction. How to let a door open as if it has changed its own mind. If you stay with me, we'll unbraid myth from method without bruising either. The famous throwing star confessed as a humble comma, tossed into a sentence so the chase has to breathe. The powders revealed not as curses, but as polite requests for the eyes to blink at the useful moment. The invisibility reframed as the oldest magic of all. Belonging, the porter's stoop, the pilgrim's upward gaze, the clerk's sincere boredom, worn like a cloak. We'll step into kitchens where intelligence is gathered with the tact of housekeeping, and into courtyards where hinges stop complaining because someone remembered the oil. We'll meet women who carried the craft in the citizenship of usefulness, seamstresses who could mend an alibi without breaking a person, market sellers whose prices doubled as weather reports, midwives whose lullabies rearranged danger's schedule, and men who preferred the smallest lever that turned the largest wheel. We'll keep company with tools that never ask to be glamorous, a flute that measures hallways and calms dogs with circular breath, a brush that writes 5 convincing hands so doors don't have to argue, a coil of silk that persuades a shudder to practice better manners. And we'll ask gentler questions than the usual ones. What if courage often looks like a rumour placed where pride can reconsider? What if the kindest victories are the mornings so ordinary that nobody remembers how close the evening came to trouble? What if the true art was always this, leaving a room at the same emotional temperature you found it, or a degree kinder, if the hour would allow? Across the night we'll follow them through war and peace alike. In storm seasons when their quiet arithmetic cancelled a battle before widows had to learn new arithmetic, and in long peace when their craft hired itself to logistics, guarding granaries from paperwork that wanted to be theft, escorting ambassadors through evenings where pride rehearsed the wrong steps, tuning the market's daily music until scales remembered how to tell the truth. We will read maps with our fingertips, eager patience, learning to kneel in fog, Kōga habits studying the angles of wind, harbour towns where lamps and knots formed an old alliance, light as witness, rope as grammar. We will listen to silence until it reveals its occupation, the kind that crushes and the kind that repairs, the hush that bullies and the quiet that notices a warped step before an ankle learns about falling. We'll even walk onto stages and into woodblock prints to see how silhouettes borrowed the story and dressed it for applause, and then slip back through the stage door to visit the real workshops, where myth bows politely to chores. Along the way, I'll give you small hooks to keep in your pocket, a bridge that remembered its name when children judged not, a door that remembered itself when a single phrase was spoken at the right time, a piece of paper that convinced a blade to take the night off, a weighing chorus that taught cargo to keep its word, and in doing so, unhired pirates. There will be snowlight on rooftops and reed beds that write cursive on canals. There will be fox tracks stitching narrow grammar towards the next chapter. There will be wind chimes offering one clean note at the threshold of every decision. Most of all, there will be a different answer to the question people think they're asking when they say ninja, not how do you vanish, but how do you take responsibility for outcomes you don't need to own. If that kind of story keeps you company, soft-footed, attentive, more housekeeping than heroics, then settle in. Over the next hour, we'll let techniques become temperaments, the patience that makes fewer enemies than a clever tongue, the empathy that reads a room until it stops pretending, the discipline that chooses the smallest gesture with the largest kindness. We'll travel slowly, with lantern light, rather than lightning, through kitchens and temples and markets and passes where thunder once auditioned. And somewhere along that gentle road you may catch yourself wondering, was the real power ever in weapons at all, or in the practice of attention until it becomes weather? Stay, listen. Let the silhouettes grow human, and the humans grow tender. By the time the lamp burns lower and the house learns sleep, you'll have met the ninjas, as I hope they wish to be remembered, not as ghosts, but as caretakers of tomorrow, arranging the world so that morning can arrive without bruises. Night has a way of teaching patience, and in the hush between crickets and the far-off river he was felt before he was known, a figure stitched to shadow, walking with the calm knowledge that history is not always written by trumpets but by footfalls that refuse to leave a print. Long before theatres and picture scrolls told a crowded world what to call him, there were gentler, more local names, words for listeners, for watchers, for those who could hold a secret without letting it hold them. West of the great city, in hillfolds where fog keeps faithful company with cedar trunks, villagers learned to live beneath the weather of war. Lords changed like seasons, banners flared and dimmed, and the map acquired a tremor. From these quiet valleys, a craft braided itself out of older fibres, the mountain path sense of Yamabushi, who read the wind as monks read sutras, the diviner's angles, testing luck the way a boatman tests current, the farmer's plain wit that knows which tools may carry two meanings, hoe in daylight, staff by night. He did not arrive with fanfare, but with a posture. Soften the body, straighten the mind, let the story walk to you. In the age of clan feuds and sudden sieges, when walls took comfort in their height and forests learned to whisper around iron, information became a kind of grain that fed armies, and this quiet worker, this patient artisan of attention, became its harvester. He measured distance with his breath, memorized floors with his toes, learned the etiquette of thresholds and the grammar of doors. A dog's bark could be negotiated. A loose tile could be taught discretion. He wore the night as other men wore creeds, not to vanish like a ghost, but to become the sort of person no one remembered to remember. Still, there were traces for those fluent in their alphabet. A lattice window opened as if it had changed its mind. A fleck of pine pitch where fingers needed grip. A garden stone nudged a hand's width to silence a squeak in the path. In provinces with rain in their syllables, Iga, Kōga, families raised children on the crafts of listening. They climbed not for glory, but from practical affection for roofs. They practiced falling as a way of honouring gravity. They played with the moon to learn how light chooses sides. Their teachers were not only men. Women held faces and schedules in their keeping, moved through markets with the grace of everydayness, carrying news the way mothers carry recipes, naturally, without ceremony. The core of the work was never cruelty. It rested on the belief that a well-placed rumour can save 100 lives, that one night of entering and leaving may prevent a week of burning. Even the tools, later swollen into legend, began humbly, rope and hook for when a wall wished to become a ladder, hollow reeds to lend breath when water needed a witness, powders that asked eyes to reconsider their plans, sandals whose prints invited the earth to tell a different story. There were ciphers, yes, but more often there were courtesies, signals tuned for the careful, a lantern, shaded once to say clear, twice to murmur not yet. He became a cartographer of other people's concerns, charting the harbours where a lord's fears were anchored, the footpaths where a retainer's loyalty wandered when unobserved. He did not despise warriors. He simply knew a gate may yield to a compliment sooner than to a ram. Amid the larger storms of the age, the castles that gathered clouds made of men, his work lived in margins, a door unlatched the night before, a map that shortened a march by an hour, a rumour tipped into a rival's cup so that sleep arrived late and suspicion early. Between temple bells and the dry squeal of turning axles, he built a philosophy from small fidelities. Shoes placed just so by the exit for a swift return, the habit of wiping dew from a step after passing, the discipline of leaving a room in the same emotional temperature as when he entered. Some would call it deception. He knew it as stewardship of outcomes, because who can claim honesty toward the world while being careless with footprints? When winter leaned its shoulder into the mountains and roads hardened into decisions, his clan gathered quietly to review the soft calendar of the year, which lords preferred songs at dinner, which messengers kept to schedules, which gatekeeper hummed when nervous. In such ledgers of tenderness and tremor, their survival was written, and there were elders who argued that the highest art was to avoid being needed at all, to arrange outcomes so that battles cancelled themselves by consensus, sieges postponed themselves by arithmetic, assassinations turned silly under a reconciliation no one could later explain. Historians would one day quarrel over vocabulary, shinobi or ninja, hero or villain, myth or method, and perhaps on a certain night he might smile at the debate, knowing that names are the last garments facts wear before sleep. What mattered was the calibration of burdens, to move a weight from a widow's memory into a ledger, to tip the scale just enough that sons returned home with their ears and the harvest finished its sentence. In the end, his beginnings were like all beginnings, ordinary hours that learned extraordinary poise. And if you stood very still in those fog-drawn valleys at dawn, you might hear the lesson he left in the hush. That attention, patient, humble, almost invisible, can become a roof under which a whole countryside breathes easier, and that somewhere beyond the last cedar, where the path bends as if deciding whom to trust, another figure is already listening for the day to open. Dawn arrived like a careful hand sliding a shoji, just a finger's width, and in that pale seam of light the craft learned to name itself, not with drums, not with a proclamation, but with the quiet confidence of a farmer who knows which furrow asks for which seed. The figure woven from shade and breath had elders, and those elders had maps inked in living rather than on paper, mountain monks who read weather inside their lungs, charcoal burners who understood how a forest keeps its accounts, widows who could hear in a merchant's laughter the price he would accept next week. In provinces where fog kept a respectful distance from bell towers, children practiced running without teaching the earth to remember, and learned that a rope is never only a rope. It is a sentence punctuated with knots, able to speak what must be said without startling the air. In one hamlet, a boy studied a hawk's shadow instead of the hawk itself, because the shadow tells where the hawk is going, not only where it has been. In another, a girl tended the ledger of arrivals at the town well, marking with a pinprick in the wood when soldiers drank greedily, and a faint chalk hush when they sipped, like men uncertain of their orders. This was the curriculum. Let the world speak first, and reply only when replying preserves the fragile dignity of the hour. Temples lent their geometry to this schooling. Rooflines taught feet the logic of triangles. Eaves offered the patience of drip and the path by which water forgives. Bamboo thickets became classrooms of resilience, showing how to bend rather than contest. River fords rehearsed the choreography of risk, step, test, step, a ballet performed in mud, with small serious bows to gravity. What later stories would embroider with black cloth and vanishing tricks was, at its heart, devotion to proportion. No grand gesture, unless a quiet one had failed. No broken door, if a conversation could unfasten the same future. He studied the music of thresholds, the difference between entering a room like a draft and entering like a pause. He bought sweets he did not need, because a vendor's memory of a kind customer could become a pass on a harder day. He carried a flute, not for songs, but to measure corridors, 3 lengths from atrium to private room, 2 from kitchen to side gate, until the body learned the house, as a musician learns a scale. Even night had its etiquettes, how to befriend a dog without teaching it disloyalty, how to step on the beam that does not complain, how to leave an apology where a footprint might have been just a wiped thread of dew on the step, a courtesy to the one who would rise before dawn and sweep. And because the age was full of quarrels dressed in brocade, banners inventing reasons, reasons inventing graves, his teachers insisted that the most elegant victory was the one that made no widows. A rumour placed like a slender wedge at the hinge of a prince's fear, a letter mislaid where a rival would find it and feel, miraculously, overprepared. A convoy delayed by the sudden good fortune of a festival, lanterns, poems, rice cakes, so that no blood learned the road that day. He learned to be custodian of losses not yet born. To outsiders he might appear a courier, a monk, a gardener who knew too much about hinges. Inside the craft he was a librarian of tremors. He could count how many heartbeats lived in the gap between a lord's smile and a steward's nod. He could weigh a household by how the cook stacked bowls after midnight. And always he returned to the notebook no one saw, a book bound in memory, written with the ink of distances and kitchen gossip, where he kept the mathematics of gentler outcomes. Travellers passing through traded tales of spectacle, walls climbed as if gravity were distracted, disguises so persuasive even the mirror believed them. But the real art was less dazzling than tender, to leave the world arranged so that tomorrow would not bruise. Perhaps that is why, when his clan met at winter's turn, the room felt more like a family mending nets than soldiers planning thunder. They spoke softly of gatekeepers' habits, of a captain calmed by oranges, of a magistrate whose vanity could be coaxed toward charity if one praised the elegance of his seal. An aunt taught the young to braid hair, not for beauty, but so a hairline could disappear beneath another name. An uncle demonstrated how to write 5 versions of the same letter: the truth delayed, the plausible lie, the lie so kind it made truth unnecessary, and the letter that said nothing and yet opened a door. In this atmosphere of careful making, courage came not from weapons but from the belief that attention is a form of mercy. And while we keep company in this late hour that forgives days for being heavy, let me ask gently, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? If this slow unfolding of history keeps you company, consider resting your finger for a moment on the small button that invites you to subscribe to the entire history so that on other quiet nights we can meet again beneath the soft lantern light of old worlds, because this craft is far from finished. The hour ahead will show a morning where techniques turn into habits, and habits gather something like a soul. The way a house earns a scent, the way a village keeps an accent no map can draw. And beyond that, morning waits a path along terraced hills, where reeds gossip and a fox leaves his philosophy in the snow. A path that seems to turn of its own accord toward a gate no one will admit to guarding. By the time the rains found their summer rhythm and the crickets rehearsed themselves into a steady choir, scattered skills had settled into something like a temperament, as if a house made of habits had quietly risen on ground everyone still swore was empty. He woke before the lanterns finished yawning towards sleep, and with the back of his hand read the floor for last night's gossip, grit from a hurried sandal, a faint polish where a steward had paced his nerves thin, a splinter that warned a plank was ready to complain. His day was counted not in errands but courtesies. At breakfast he sat near the doorway to feel the house breathe when servants crossed. He memorized the small staccato of lacquer against wood, against rice, the intimate vocabulary of bowls meeting trays. When a messenger arrived, he did not interrogate the message. He asked after the man's feet, because feet confess truths tongues arrange. In villages, where bamboo fences learned the names of wind, he moved as a gardener, trimming talk so gossip wouldn't choke the path. In towns where market bells stitched the hours together, he put on the patience of a scribe, practicing a script official enough to open doors, yet modest enough to be ignored when doors should remain doors. There were exercises, yes, but none that invited applause. He walked beams with a bowl filled to the rim, learning balance's liturgy, that a steady body makes fewer enemies than a clever tongue. He listened to rooms until they quit pretending, heard which board complained by nature, which hinge sighed from habit, which corner welcomed dust more quickly than the rest. He trained his eyes to watch how light keeps promises. A window that invites morning at a certain angle will keep that appointment again, and a friend like that can be asked to sketch a map across tomorrow. If sometimes he studied powders that coaxed eyes into second thoughts or knots, that taut roped the manners of a staircase, he kept them like spare verses, useful, never the chorus. The chorus was restraint. Choose the smallest lever that turns the largest wheel without breaking it. Along the borders of proud provinces, whose very names seemed pleasant on the tongue of rain, there were households that lived under preparedness, the way monks live under bells, not anxiously, but with the patience of people who intend to keep their neighbours. A child learned to place sandals facing outward at night, so that feet and fate could agree in an emergency. A grandmother folded letters so a reader's thumb would, almost by accident, find the sentence that mattered first. An uncle taught that the quickest route across a guarded court is not speed but belonging. Carry the right bundle, adopt the right slow hurry, become the reason no one looks twice. He learned disguises the way trees learn seasons, by consenting to time, not forcing it. A porter's stoop, a pilgrim's upward gaze, a shopkeeper's attentive boredom. And these were not costumes so much as dialects of the body, practiced with a courtesy that never slipped into caricature. Tools joined the grammar, a flute to measure corridors, and calm dogs with patient circular breath, sandals that wrote a different story in mud. A thread of silk tied to a shutter so the night breeze could do a hand's small work. And maps, always maps, rarely on paper that could be seized, but in kitchens remembered like favourite songs, in the steps from bath to garden egress, in the way A particular bridge plank answered a personal question. The more he learned, the less he wished for spectacle. He saw how noise invited counter-noise, how thunder spent credit it didn't have. When a lord's temper massed like summer storm heads, he might arrange a misdirected convoy to cork a road just long enough for envoys from a conciliatory cousin to arrive first. When a hot-blooded captain hunted glory, he might let the captain's favourite horse throw a shoe beside a tea pavilion where a retired magistrate, friend to restraint, welcomed accidents. When a gate needed to forget itself for an evening, he discovered how easily a gatekeeper sleeps when a certain apothecary receives an anonymous donation for a sick child. It was not sainthood, only a stubborn belief that tomorrow should not pay for what today could solve with a nudge and a kindness. There were darker commissions. The age refused gentleness, and sometimes a candle had to be pinched out before it taught the house to burn. On such nights he moved, as a prayer moves, without spectacle, asking forgiveness of floorboards that helped him, leaving the room with the same emotional temperature it held before he entered. He believed, perhaps naively and perhaps correctly, that even necessity can be asked to speak softly. Historians later would quarrel, as they must. Names, dates, schools, whether this valley taught a stricter patience than that ridge. He would not argue. He would pour tea, invite them to notice how steam tells time more honestly than clocks, and propose that the craft's heart lives not in feats, but in fidelities. Set the shoes for a quick exit. Wedge the door to shelter the absent. Compose the rumour that prevents a duel rather than avenges it. And as we rest together in this kind hour, when the walls themselves seem to breathe a little slower, may I ask gently, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? If this slow, lantern-lit unfolding keeps you company, consider subscribing to the entire history, so these soft-footed journeys can find you again on nights when sleep wants a story to walk it to the threshold. The road continues from here. Tomorrow's lesson waits in a thicket where reeds write letters on the water, and a fox, tail-tipped with moonlight, tests the snow for news. The path bends like a thoughtful question toward a compound whose door appears unguarded, and somewhere beyond that quiet door, a single wind chime knows exactly when to sing. By late autumn, the hills wore their quiet browns, and the paddies kept a mirror where geese could practice leaving, and in that gentler light the craft revealed its spine. Logistics, the slow poetry of arranging a life so that emergencies arrive and find nothing to brag about. He rose with the charcoal breath of dawn and walked the perimeter of a town that had learned caution without bitterness, counting not the guards but the rhythms. Which gate opened late because a keeper preferred his daughter to finish her porridge, which alley gathered a bakery's perfume just before the watch changed, which shrine struck its bell a heartbeat after the market's first crate met the ground. He watched as a gardener watches weather, listening for what the day intended. A single cart with a stubborn, limping wheel could write a paragraph of delay across a street. A borrowed ox with a persuasive yawn could become a negotiator for peace. He tended budgets of patience, the candles no one would need if a meeting concluded before dusk, the rope that lived as a laundry line until it must suddenly remember to be a ladder, the sandals that could pass for a courier's if they learned to collect dust with the right degree of sincerity. In a town where rain gutters murmured from eave to eave, he found employment as a clerk, because clerks are the seamstresses of reality. With a neat hand he stitched names to appointments and persuaded hours to sit exactly where they belonged. He borrowed the magistrate's vanity for gentle labour by praising the calligraphy of mercy, that beautiful script in which a harsh sentence is re-inked into a fine or a pilgrimage, and he discovered that most doors far prefer to be opened by belonging rather than force, so he studied the accents of usefulness, carry baskets with the correct plausible tiredness, keep the polite stoop of a man, explained by errands, tune the breath to the pace of those nearby until their bodies grant permission to be ignored. Intelligence was gathered with the tact of housekeeping. He noted who refilled lamps early, and who delayed until wicks turned sullen, who sang when content, and who sang when frightened, who saved scraps of string, and who saved silence. A dog that barks at everyone becomes a teacher of nothing. A dog that sometimes chooses not to bark is a tutor in exceptions, and he befriended such tutors with the respect of not requiring them to choose. His tools remained modest, familiar as kitchen cutlery, serious as a widow's ledger. A folded reed sluice to send messages downstream like careful trout. A flute for measuring rooms and smoothing the night's temper, powder that asked eyes to blink at the right instant, needles that adored cloth but knew wood when addressed softly, a length of silk that coaxed a stubborn shutter into complicity with the evening breeze. He treated them as one treats elders, with gratitude and a mild suspicion toward theatrics. In provinces where mountain shoulders spell old prayers merely by how they stand, he met others sworn to the same covenant of quiet efficacy. They gathered not in oaths but in chores. A woman repairing thatch so rain would lose interest in eaves, a man charting a lord's vanity by observing how messengers were seated, a child practicing the deliberate art of dropping a tray without guilt, knowing that one day a tray must fall, and no one should wonder why it fell precisely then. Here the craft matured into temperament. When violence could not be refused, it was trimmed to the least cruel shape. More often, it was replaced entirely by the elegant arithmetic of misdirection. A rival convoy learned that a bridge was under repair on the very morning a festival invited alternative routes lined with lanterns and tea. An aggressive captain discovered his future recalculated by a shoe that failed him beside a scholar whose opinions, strong and gentle, happened to favour restraint. A feud paused because both parties were nudged toward the same barber, who possessed a gift for eliciting confessions and a thrifty policy of charging less if peace was attempted before noon. He came to believe the universe noticed such economies of harm, that somewhere tallies were kept, not of deaths, but of disasters that never quite assembled. During the months when fog rested in the cedar crowns like a congregation rehearsing humility, he studied the etiquette of leaving rooms unchanged, an art that demanded more feeling than stealth. He trained himself to exit, without a draft, to return every object to its small destiny, to soften the echo of his own passage until even dust felt unbothered. At thresholds he paused to bless the caretakers who would rise before the sun and sweep, and he left a slim apology of wiped dew where his foot had troubled a clean board. He did not imagine himself heroic. He served as a caretaker of outcomes, a librarian of tomorrows filed under unremarkable, secretly proud of the mornings that passed without stories. Historians of a later age would diagram tactics, ranking valleys, by the strictness of their patience, but he would have poured tea and pointed them to the window, asking whether they heard how rain negotiated with the roof. Every drop in its place, no shouting, yet fields fattened on that conversation. And as we linger here in this soft hour, your room keeping its patient shadows while our two silences sit like neighbours at the same low table, may I ask gently where you are listening from, and what time is keeping you company there? If these lantern-lit paths and soft-footed lessons help your night unclench, consider subscribing to the entire history. So, on future evenings, we can meet again among cedar scent and wind chime counsel, because from this town of careful habits the road goes on, a narrow track toward terraces that hold the moon like a bowl, a half-forgotten Polston that practices being unimportant, a village where foxes leave little philosophies in the snow. And somewhere ahead, in a house that pretends to be ordinary by day, a single wind chime already knows which moment is ours. Winter's first breath arrived not as snow, but as a clarity in the air that made roofs sound more honest beneath sparrows. And in that crystalline listening, the craft ripened from a list of tricks into an ecology. Many small fidelities keeping one another company until safety felt like a kind of weather. And before dawn, he walked the ridgeline while the village doused its last lamps and practiced a quiet arithmetic with his feet. 27 steps from the watchman's favourite stool to the fence corner where the boards formed a hushed consonant. 41 from the brewer's side gate to the alley that remembered rain. 11 from the tea stall to the stone that never wobbled. These were not measurements so much as confidences the town loaned him, and he handled them with the careful gratitude reserved for tools that also have feelings. In the market, he learned to be useful in convincingly unimportant ways. A man who returned a dropped comb, who steadied a ladder while a sign was rehung, who listened as a widow priced her spices and nodded with the exact tempo that told her she had folded mercy into the recipe. Usefulness is a passport with many stamps. It let him belong without ever petitioning to be seen. On days when rumour thickened like overboiled syrup, he thinned it by asking 3 precise questions in 3 distant places until the story exhausted itself chasing its own echo. On nights when anxiety moved through inns like a draught, he warmed the room by staging small interruptions. A travelling flautist committed to slow scales, a cart that needed communal pushing at the very corner where quarrels preferred to begin. A monk whose sermon on patience arrived at the minute 2 tempers were sharpening. He learned that the world behaves better when given reasons to do so. The tools kept their humility and their stubborn excellence. A brush that could write in 5 hands, squire, clerk, pilgrim, mother, merchant, not to forge lives but to speak politely with doors. A narrow reed that ferried a sentence downstream under the pretense of leaf litter. A thread, fine as resolved worry, that taught a shudder when to whisper. Powders that coaxed a proud eye into becoming a blinking ally. Sandals that remembered which mud writes in cursive and which prints each letter as if learning to read. He never worshipped the kit. He worshipped proportion, the patient habit of choosing the smallest gesture capable of escorting an hour from peril back to ordinary. When violence could not be talked out of the room, he trimmed it to the least unkind shape and made apology not with words but with the absence of complaint left behind him. Elders in his province, hair the colour of old parchment, taught that the highest triumph is a morning as boring as bread, and so he oversaw boredom like a foreman of quiet industry. A feud cooled because 2 cousins were steered into the same queue for sesame oil, where a quick apprentice offered riddles whose answers required cooperation. A dangerous courier lost his timetable to the sudden magnetism of a lantern festival, and by the time the last poem was recited, his message had softened into an old problem already solved elsewhere. A lord's agent, eager for cruelty, misplaced his appetite in a tea garden where the waitress praised his calligraphy so sincerely that his vanity learned gentleness for a single crucial hour. None of this looked like heroism because the horizon did not catch fire. And that was the point. In cedar-shadowed valleys that trained eager patience, and in their cousins, where Kōga habit studied the angles of fog, the craft increasingly resembled a library of weather wisdom, how to read a household by the order of its wet sandals, how to predict a guard's drowsiness from the time signature of his humming, how to persuade a door to open by first persuading a room that nothing unexpected was entering. Manuals would one day be copied, stones engraved with names, arguments classified into schools. But for now, the living text was written on air, passed aunt to niece, uncle to nephew, by the soft authority of those who had seen enough winters to favour solutions that left hands clean. He apprenticed himself by doing chores to the point of grace, mending a thatch seam so perfectly that Rain forgot it was clever, sorting rice by noticing which grain insisted on telling the truth about the harvest, practicing the practice of practice until attention itself became shelter. As the year turned toward deeper quiet, he understood that secrecy need not be a cage, it can be a courtesy, a promise to carry someone else's fear on tiptoe so their children don't overhear. And in our own still hour, while your room rehearses the lullaby of its familiar shadows and the road outside rests between sentences, may I ask softly, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? If this slow, lantern-lit telling keeps you company, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history, so on future nights, these gentle corridors of the past can find you again without hurrying, because the path ahead is waiting, toward a fortified town pretending to be tired of its own defences, toward a snowfield where a fox leaves grammar in the shape of footsteps, toward a modest house, with one wind chime that knows exactly when to sing. And somewhere beyond that chime, a map is being folded along lines that appear only in moonlight, a prelude to the first mission whose success will look precisely like nothing happening at all. The first mission arrived the way winter letters do in careful households, folded without flourish, sealed with modest wax, and carried by someone who looked as if he'd rather be telling you the weather. A market town sat between two proud lords, like a candle between mirrors. Each insisted he would not blow it out, yet drafts have a gift for inventing themselves. At dawn, a shipment of rice pledged as winter arms to the temple granary would meet a rival convoy hauling iron fittings for a castle gate at the same crossroads at the same hour. The merchants had argued themselves into fear, the captains had rehearsed their reasons, and the air kept a ledger of endings that smelled like shouting. He read the letter with the patience of a man listening for a floorboard's opinion. The task, as ink told it, was ordinary. Let the rice arrive at its warehouse, teach the iron to wait, and give the town another day of being forgettably alive. He set out at dusk with the agreeable tiredness of a porter carrying almost nothing, a brush that could speak in 5 hands, a reed content to masquerade as river trash, a coil of silk with the knack of coaxing shudders into courtesy, powders that asked eyes to blink at a useful moment, and sandals fluent in the difference between mud that gossips and mud that minds its business. Before planning, he apprenticed himself to the place, listening for the small grammar by which it stayed itself. The sake brewer's dog disliked men who whistled. The gatekeeper's cough always arrived just before the bell. The innkeeper's boy practiced calligraphy in the hallway where echoes behaved, making a daily alphabet of sound. He let the town introduce its habits, like relatives at a quiet wedding. Then he began arranging a sequence of small favours that could pass for weather. A lantern festival, postponed by rain in autumn, deserved one sentimental evening, if only someone reminded the abbot that memory has a right to light. He did that with the kind of compliment that lets a man believe he has remembered himself. A road mender, proud of straight edges, was persuaded to tend the bridge plank that groaned like a sore conscience. It would be rude, after all, to host heavy carts on a complaint. A tea vendor, with a flair for riddles, received a brief poem about patience, and took it as an omen to stage a riddle contest at the crossroads precisely when Iron intended to hurry through. None of this looked like strategy. It looked like town life, polishing its manners. He borrowed the magistrate's vanity by delivering, in the magistrate's own tidy script, a note from a fictitious cousin praising the Solomonic clarity of his scheduling in difficult times. The magistrate blushed into competence and, without quite knowing why, moved the iron convoy's permit an hour forward. As for the rice, he rose before dawn and walked with its handlers like another hired back. He helped a mule choose a kinder path around a puddle, admired a grandmother's knot that made a rope serve as both cradle and handle, and wondered aloud whether the temple bell preferred greeting charity at first light or full light. Full light, ruled the eldest carrier, pleased to sit as theologian. Thus the rice, out of reverence, delayed itself into safety. The iron, arriving early by the wisdom of a rescheduled permit, met riddles shouted by children who gave sesame cakes as prizes. A lieutenant fell into proving his intellect, then his patience, then his appetite. One cart's pin remembered to loosen on the bridge and required the public virtue of communal pushing. In that cheerful pause, a breathless clerk, no one's and everyone's, announced that monks had blessed the road beyond, and it must be walked, not ridden, for 108 breaths to avoid offence. Who quarrels with blessings in winter? By the time Iron had walked itself into humility, the rice, escorted by song and the abbot's fondest bell, slipped through and entered the granary like a promise kept. He drew no blade, unless you count the thin blade of timing. He merely trimmed chance into courtesy. Yet danger prowled even an hour that seemed tamed. A hot-blooded retainer, ashamed the day would escape without an anecdote, sought quarrel with the obliging porter who had been helpful in too many places. Our quiet friend accepted insult as one accepts weather, acknowledging it without adopting it. He asked whether the retainer would honour the temple by allowing him to carry a message across its forecourt. The ruse was so mild, it felt like hospitality. With proud assent, he entered the courtyard and used the old geometry of eaves. Stepping where roofs teach rain to hesitate, he turned left into a pocket of silence that had been auditioning all morning for the role of exit. Caught between piety and pique, the retainer chose piety and found his anger dissolving into the simple heat of tea. Not every story allows such luck. The craft never promises the world will accept correction by kindness. But that day, the town preferred boredom to heroics, and he helped boredom keep its throne. At dusk, he returned his instruments of moving weather to their small sleep, silk coiled into a comma, flute breathing softly into its cloth, brush washed until it remembered only its own hairs. He recorded nothing except a private line in a ledger the world cannot read, disaster attempted, declined, and slept with the unremarkable satisfaction of a man whose work is measured by absences. Morning found the granary door wearing a knotted ribbon from an anonymous admirer of scheduling. The magistrate felt seen by the universe. The iron reached the castle neither early nor late, but exactly when gossip had finished with it. If anyone asked how the day avoided remembering itself too loudly, people pointed to the lanterns, the riddles, the cheerful business with the cart, the blessing that required 108 breaths, the bell, each small reason so convincing that together they made cause and effect look like old neighbours sharing soup. And somewhere beyond the last roof, on the path where reeds write their opinions on water, a fox crossed without hurry, tail raised like punctuation at the end of a merciful sentence, as if to say the road ahead would ask for more than cleverness. It would ask for loyalty to the unseen, to the quiet arithmetic that keeps villages whole, while maps argue themselves hoarse. Winter settled into that lucid band of days, when sound travels farther than it should, gates creaking their opinions downstream, river ice offering a council of small clicks. And in that thinner light, the craft changed again, not by altering its outline, but by adding rings. The magistrate's unsigned letter of thanks, all awkward brushstrokes addressed to no one in particular, lived folded in his sleeve like a quiet talisman, a reminder that victories measured in boredom still demand upkeep. He returned to the valley, where cedar crowns gather fog, like careful vows, and let his life resemble chores that had discovered a philosophy. He swept a courtyard, because sweeping is a map of priorities. Dust first, from corners where neglect breeds, then along the path where guests' feet confess their manners. He mended a roof seam, because rain is a reliable teacher of consequences. He sat with novices and learned again, through an old aunt's patient wrists, how pouring tea so steadily can persuade time itself to walk more softly. Some lessons arrived without language. A master who could dissolve into shadow corrected him with silence arranged to a particular contour, teaching him to hear the difference between being ignored and being taught by absence. Another elder, her hair tied with dust-coloured ribbon, showed him how to tire a lying rumour, not by shouting truth at it, but by giving it an errand it cannot complete until it exhausts itself. They practised on something harmless, the whispered arrival of a famous performing cat, and by nightfall the village had laughed itself back to plainness. He developed a librarian's respect for catalogues, inventories of grain, ladders, debts, and kindnesses, a ledger of weather noting which wind made speech brittle and which made dogs philosophical, the ethical gate of snow, which taught how to disturb without damaging and to pass only by the field's consent. Yet even as the seasons tutored his patience, the work kept leaning toward people and the tremors that live beneath reputations. He studied how pride whistles when lonely, how grief rearranges furniture, how power orders the wrong tea when it is afraid. In a nearby province, a young noble had risen, wrapping inexperience in lacquered decisiveness. His courtiers, new to their roles, invented emergencies to justify themselves, apprentices to thunder playing with borrowed drums. The craft moved, not to humiliate them, but to coax the future away from brittle spectacle, and sent him to watch not with the knives of a spy, but with the shade of a gardener deciding where to plant mercy. He arrived as a bird seller, cages containing mostly air and a few polite sparrows for show, and learned the house by its small fidelities. The rhythm of reed brooms through the courtyards, the door that lingered open as if hoping to be forgiven, the steward's syllable count when flattering the new lord's seal. The young lord loved order the way a nervous man loves lists. His fear disguised itself as neatness. A visit was coming from a veteran general whose patience had once kept 3 towns alive. The courtiers, threatened by competence, planned theatre, mock arrests, sudden inspections, a feast of noisy resolve, dramas that breed widows. He began braiding a counter-harvest. He befriended the woman who kept the laundry, because laundry tells the truth about a house. From her he learned which uniforms fit men who avoided violence, and which fit those courting it. A sparrow bought him an hour at the bathhouse woodpile, where he learned the general disliked demons in policy, but enjoyed them in literature. A well-placed quotation could tilt the day. He left a scrap of verse in the steward's pocket, in the steward's own hand, of course, reminding the household that the bravest roofs are those that let rain remain rain, a proverb the steward later repeated with the air of long conviction. Then came small rearrangements. The mock arrests were postponed when the keys to the demonstration cells could not be found until after the visit, when they turned up precisely where the steward swore he had searched. Inspection routes detoured around a temporary scaffolding erected to mend a perfectly healthy eave. The general arrived to a different theatre, kitchen apprentices rehearsing emergency rice porridge, gatekeepers practicing how to read worry rather than rank, clerks comparing tax rolls until discrepancies blushed and confessed. The house performed competence without aggression, and the performance felt like sincerity because this is the secret it was. The young lord, spared the embarrassment of his own thunder, found himself admired for a discipline he had not yet earned. Admiration lays obligations upon brittle men, and under that gentle weight some shapes soften. That evening, the general spoke of bridges that survive war because their keepers love them. From the margin of lamplight, he watched the room's temperature shift by degrees until hands rested easier on hilts and sentences preferred the quieter end of themselves. Of course, the world hosts antagonists who hunger for noise. One retainer, white scarf tied with the arrogance of unearned certainty, prowled for a culprit to blame for the day's lack of spectacle, and fixed on the bird seller. "You make cages," he sneered. "Do you also make escapes?" The answer settled like a towel laid over a sleeping child. "Only the kind with open doors." The line lodged as a splinter, and in the weeks of worrying at it, some portion of the man's cruelty remembered a better use for strength. When the mission closed, as they often do, with everyone convinced they had saved themselves, he left by the service gate carrying cages full of air and the evening's hush like a blessing. Back in the valley, he added another ring to the tree and taught the novices what the day had taught him. Some houses want to be fierce because they are frightened. Arrange a day in which they can practice competence instead. He repeated the ethic that has become his spine. Choose the smallest lever that turns the largest wheel without breaking it, and leave a room at the same emotional temperature you found it, or a degree kinder if you can. Outside fox tracks stitched their slender grammar into the snow. Reeds wrote cursive across the frozen canal, and from a hill house a single wind chime gave one clean note, just enough to suggest that in the next province a different weather was gathering its argument, hoping for a hand like his to edit it into mercy. Spring began rehearsing itself in the river long before the plum blossoms had the courage to confess, and in that shy rehearsal the craft turned to its quieter mathematics, the braid between breath and echo that makes a rumour walk, the way a fence learns trust from hands that mend it. He returned to the valley with pockets empty of everything but attention, and was given, as if by accident, a curriculum that began in kitchens. "A household," the aunt said, tying her dust-coloured ribbon, "is a republic of small promises. Learn its constitution, and you will be welcomed as a citizen." So he apprenticed himself to ordinary things. He washed rice until the water ran honest. He tuned his ear to the soft drum of lids settling on pots. He watched steam write brief letters on window panes and tried to read their mood before they vanished. In the courtyard he swept with the humility of weather, noticing where dust preferred to meet and where corners forgot themselves after guests departed. He learned which stair required a complement of oil to stop complaining. At the long table with novices he practiced writing 5 versions of the same sentence: the truth delayed, the useful kindness, the silence that opens a door, and the apology shaped like an invitation. And discovered ink holds ethics if the hand refuses to hurry. When day turned to errands, he studied the city as if it were an instrument longing to be tuned. Bridges tuned with repairs, markets with gossip set to an acceptable key, temples with the timing of bells. He carried a flute, not for songs, but to measure passages, 3 flute lengths here, 2 there. A mnemonic less conspicuous than string. With the same flute and a patient, round breath he calmed a dog devoted to barking at ideas, until the animal liked the sound of not needing to decide. Elders taught him codes disguised as courtesies, sandals placed outward for swift exits, a chrysanthemum sketched in the receipt's corner to mean the guest will return, a ribbon on a gatepost tied in a knot that whispered, "Wait 2 breaths before we speak." He met the craft's small pharmacy, powders that asked eyes to reconsider their timing, salves that taught splinters to surrender, a pinch of smoke that told rooms to forget a stranger's outline, and learned never to love a trick more than the future it served. Kunoichi, women whose strengths were phrased in habits rather than boasts, offered him a lighter grammar. A midwife taught the citizenship of usefulness, carry water, no lullabies, remember the price of sesame for those who cannot leave their doors. A seamstress, with fingers like accurate wind, taught disguises as manners rather than costumes, the porter's stoop, the widow's punctuality, the pilgrim's upward gaze, borrowed with tender respect, never as mockery. "If you wear someone's day," she said, tucking a needle behind her ear, "you owe it a good ending." He listened to the city draw its self-portrait in chores, and discovered maps can be copied into muscle. The weight of a certain gait on the left shoulder, the temperature of a warehouse corridor at noon, the tone of a guard's humming when rain flirted with the horizon. In the evenings, a young monk, friendly with mathematics, revealed ciphers that hid inside arias and shopping lists. How a sequence of lantern heights could count to a rendezvous. How stepping stones, wide, narrow, narrow, wide, could recite a timetable to those who knew their dialect. He practiced leaving rooms kinder than he found them. A bowl straightened, a latch persuaded to close, without complaint, a small coin nested under a broom to honour the hands that would rise before daybreak. And when talk, as it must, turned toward danger, they took him to the shed where ropes learned second careers and grapnels waited, like punctuation meant for scholars of eaves. There the elder who never raised his voice taught the arithmetic of assent, let weight live in the hips, begin silence in the soles, pay gratitude to a beam before asking trust. He climbed not to conquer roofs, but to become their confidant. From the tiles he saw a city that kept secrets mostly from shyness, not malice, and understood that secrecy, rightly held, can be a shelter for good intentions until they are strong enough to stand without being bullied. News came from a river town. 2 merchants had begun a duel by proxy, sending clerks to trade insults and sharpening the air with bravado that births accidents. He went, not to choose sides, but to restore the weather in which choosing sides would feel foolish. He entered as a reader of ledgers, a man hired to discover which columns had forgotten their arithmetic. By afternoon he had located each man's pride. One worshipped neat sums, the other adored flourishes that taught accounts to sing. He borrowed both vanities for peace, a display of perfect columns here, a page of elegant annotations there, and a staged error arranged so each could be gracefully magnanimous in discovering it. A tea seller with a theatrical wink hosted the reconciliation. The room, pleased with itself, applauded its own maturity, and he slipped out by the kitchen so the applause could belong to those who needed it. Back in the valley, he copied the day into memory and burned the paper, an old refusal of trophies. The elders nodded, not for success, but for the absence of noise. "You are learning to be a roof," one said, "and roofs are praised best by crops." Night travelled up the hills, patient and unafraid. He walked the ridge to hear cedar breath, and from a neighbouring house, the single chime that had chosen him as its student. In that one note lay a promise that work would soon demand both steadier courage and a gentler touch. A neighbouring province held a lord who mistook cruelty for order, and a temple granary that wished to be kept safe without becoming a story. He paused at the threshold, left a thin line of white dew, his signature of apology, and turned toward the path where reeds compose letters on water and a fox writes its slender grammar across new snow, a path that bends as if it already knows which door will open before anyone admits there is a door. There is. The road into the new province sloped so gently it felt like a promise not to startle, yet the air carried that brittle clarity that comes when rules are spoken too loudly. Even the river ran in lines straighter than it preferred. The Lord here worshipped order with the zeal of a recent convert, papers stacked with parade ground precision, punishments measured like lengths of wood, kindness audited as if it were a suspicious expense. On a low ridge, the temple kept a granary whose rice was meant to fatten the hungry weeks between spring's promises and summer's arrivals. Rumour said the Lord Steward planned to requisition it for security, which often means hunger with lacquer. He entered as a man who priced ropes and mended ladders, useful, forgettable, already a little dusty, rented a corner of a cooper's shed, and began, as always, with courtesy to the place. The bite of cress by the river market at dawn, the watch bell's rhythm, impatient on the third strike, the way dogs here barked not at strangers but at hesitation. The temple itself was patient timber, its grain darkened into experienced gentleness. He bowed to the bell and introduced himself to chores, quieting a step that had learned to complain, trading a story about sesame for the privilege of washing pots, chalking tally boards with a novice until numbers felt like faithful friends instead of bureaucracy. From these small permissions he learned the truth beneath the rumour. The steward would not steal the rice so much as suffocate it with procedure, an inspection to discover irregularities, a temporary seal on the doors, then protective custody that walked sacks downhill into soldiers' bowls, law as a net, virtue as a slogan. He did not sharpen a knife, he sharpened tenderness. With the abbot, whose eyebrows had learned solemnity on behalf of the rest of his face, he rehearsed a liturgy of paperwork, receipts with clean edges, stamps in tidy harmony, tallies copied by two different hands. Paper that tells the truth is difficult to bully. He coaxed the ledger to sing in three parts: the harvest as counted by the temple, the harvest as donated by named households, each signature a small lantern against confiscation, and a third list, soft as a shadow, of debts already owed by the Lord's kitchens to those same households, because dignity behaves better when it recognises itself. He borrowed too the kunoichi's lesson that disguise can be courtesy. Two women of the craft widened the temple's orbit, a midwife whose satchel smelled of fennel and clean cotton, citizenship immediate, for babies do not bow to inspection schedules, and a spinner of thread whose wrists moved like well-behaved swallows, visiting the steward's house to mend torn sleeves until she learned the wife's private calendar of grievances and mercies. "Stir her tea clockwise," the spinner whispered, amused and reverent, and she remembers how to be kind. Around the inspection he rearranged the air itself. A carpenter discovered. The bell frame required bracing. Scaffolds rose precisely where officials would wish to parade, and a rope with a courteous habit of tangling insisted that any procession must take the side path, narrower, quieter, easier to shepherd. The abbot remembered that an old statue needed laundering. Novices bore it back and forth with such ceremony that shouting felt ill-mannered. Meanwhile, He walked the markets with a ledger of donations written in public, careful script, earmarking grain for households with infants, naming need in daylight forces confiscation to own its cruelty. He also offered the steward a bridge for dignity, a petition copied in the steward's hand by an assistant, requesting a joint audit in which the Lord's household would be honoured as guardian, never owner, of relief rice for the people whose taxes make fortresses meaningful. Words matter when they give frightened men a version of themselves they would rather be. Inspection day arrived. Wearing polished sandals, the steward, flanked by clerks, entered with the posture of a man who believes in lines and expects misalignment to greet him. Instead, he met an orchestra of order, ledger boards aligned like a respectful chorus, measuring chords set out, scales proved against a stone verified by the Lord's own mason. The abbot's eyebrows sang a mild welcome. The officials were politely shepherded down the scaffolded side path where shadow and silence practiced their craft. There the midwife waylaid the steward's wife with an emergency that was not theatre, a cramped labour in a gatekeeper's house, and anyone who has seen a child decide to arrive knows schedules are pretend. The wife's urgency pulled the steward's attention as a tide pulls a boat, and because birth interrupts cruelty more efficiently than argument, the inspection lost its conductor. In the granary, clerks read aloud from tidy tallies that accounted for every sack, every handful donated by name. The spinner stood beside the abbot, copying each receipt in an elegant second hand that made the room feel like a lesson in adult behaviour. When a junior clerk, eager to perform suspicion, sniffed at a pale missing mark on a wall, a novice stepped forward with respectful embarrassment. He had polished the board, not knowing chalk was sacred. The abbot forbore to scold. The clerk, enlarged by unexpected generosity, abandoned pettiness. It is difficult to cut a ribbon on a door that has just said, "Please." By afternoon, the steward, tired of having nothing to oppose, signed the joint audit, pleased to imagine himself guardian of order rather than its punisher, and accepted a ceramic jar of rice for his household in acknowledgement of vigilance. Gratitude is a leash that doesn't look like one. The sacks stayed where they belonged. No swords learned new language. Quietly, a handful of families found their portions grown by the size of a baby's appetite. He left no name, only a step that no longer complained, a bell frame braced for the next storm, and a ledger able to hold its head up even in an enemy's hands. That night, in the cooper's shed, he washed his brush until it remembered only itself and coiled his silk into a comma, promising the evening there would be no exclamation points. In the ledger, the world cannot read, he wrote one line, "Rice remained rice," and slept like a roof that has kept its promise. Near midnight, a wind found the scaffolding and made a sound like someone tidying their thoughts. Far off, on the river's patient bend, a fox tested the mud and left a slender grammar pointing toward hills where another house was learning to call fear discipline. Above the dark ridge of roofs, a single wind chime timed one perfect note, and he understood. The next task would not be a defence but a rescue, and its door would pretend not to exist until a hand arrived that knew how to knock without knocking. Mist announced the rescue the way it greets a riverbank, sudden only to the unpractised ear, and in this province where fear spoke bureaucratic eloquence, a scholar scribe had been folded into a tidy room to await review, which is winter without the courtesy of an ending. His wife reached the valley with hands that didn't know where to rest, and a letter that refused to accuse. He read it as he would a floorboard, palms where weight tells truth. The scholar had kept tax ledgers, honest enough to sing, and that song had offended a retainer who preferred arithmetic with fog. The charge wore a monocle of law, misplaced records, irregular annotations, excessive neatness suggesting intention, and the jail was a warehouse pretending otherwise. Windows so modest they felt like apologies, its door non-existent for anyone without the correct adjectives in their blood. At dusk, beneath an eave that practiced listening, the kunoichi gathered, fennel-scented midwife with lullabies in the right key, seamstress with wind-accurate fingers, who had twice mended the jailer's cuff and charged less the second time because the thread enjoyed its work, and a monk who carried mathematics in his sleeves and mischief in his hymns, offering a schedule disguised as prayer, bells placed where vanity is soothed and vigilance drifts. He arrived as a bookmender, ink-stained and apologetic, the kind of broom the world notices without seeing, carrying the grammar he trusts, a brush fluent in 5 hands, a reed that could pass for yesterday's river, silk that whispers shudders into courtesy, powders teaching eyes to blink at useful instants, sandals that know which mud gossips and which minds its manners. Before plan could become plot, he apprenticed himself to the building's biography. Rafters that inhaled as carts rolled by, a hinge declining the day in a particular pitch, a seam of wall where sun and shade negotiated their truce. He watched deliveries pretending not to be, laundry baskets stuffed with law, water buckets tended by men who did not sweat, a bamboo ladder that visited only when accounting needed height, and understood that the scholar's confinement was not cruel but correct, paper armour that asks the world to be impressed by its tidiness. The answer would be a circle drawn with kindness. A festival for nobody first. The riddle seller happened to arrive, and children clustered like commas around a difficult clause. A tea store rolled itself to the corner where quarrels like to begin and replaced them with steam. The monk's bell developed a courteous cough that rearranged the town's posture. One solemn note at the hour guards preferred to shift their weight, another discreet chime when arrogance admired itself in glass. The midwife was summoned to a real urgency, the guard sister's child choosing breath earlier than scheduled, and hot water required fast hands that required the seamstress to borrow the laundry route, which ran past the warehouse's shy side door, a door that did not exist until towels persuaded it. At midday, he walked the alley once to teach his body its syntax. The slick tile, the polite gravel, the plank with a private complaint, and tucked a coin beneath an inn broom as thanks to the unseen hands that would rise early and help his footprints unhappen. At twilight he soothed the bitter hinge with oil, remembering the general's lesson that bridges survive because they are loved. The seamstress stitched a receipt that had not yet been born, the steward's tidy hand obligingly precise. The monk counted breaths between bell and cough. The midwife borrowed a phrase from the jailer's wife, "Bless the roof," to serve as a coupon for mercy should curiosity wake too soon. At the agreed hour, the street turned to the work of innocence, children shouting riddles, a cart suffering a theatrical pin, neighbours pushing in cheerful competence, bowls poured as if tea were small, drinkable poems. Time itself seemed content to be managed. He lifted the laundry basket like a man with errands and entered a corridor that pretended to be a breeze. Silk found a shudder's conscience. Reed shaped itself into yesterday's debris, and he moved as taught, weight in the hips, silence beginning in the soles, gratitude paid to every beam. The scholar looked up from his tidy indignation. "Do you mend spines?" he asked, out of habit more than hope. "Only those that want hair to stand," he said, smile folded into a receipt and produced the joint audit order acknowledging a temporary transfer for clarification of annotations stamped with the steward's impeccable forgeries of himself. The guard, careful rather than cruel, examined the paper with the luxury of doing his job correctly. "Bless the roof," he murmured, the phrase travelling homeward through his throat, without knowing it had been routed by mercy. And so the not door became a door, and the corridor a hallway that had always expected them. Outside, the riddle air made bystanders into collaborators without telling them. A dog hired by nobody practiced neutrality, and with a dusting of gentle powder decided that blinking was the smartest kind of watchfulness. The scholar put on a porter's posture and accepted the laundry basket as a temporary sky. They passed through the market as if explained by it, a bookmender with a tired helper, a tea buyer discussing tannins, citizens of errands, and at the temple the monk received them with the honest fuss reserved for paperwork that knows its own goodness. In a room of clean wood and corrected thoughts, the scholar was given back his name. No trumpet, only tea that did not hurry, and a ledger where his steadiness could re-enter the city as a public asset. Evening folded itself into courtesies. The seamstress returned the jailer's cuff with an edge so perfect the man's wrist felt newly literate. The midwife let fennel bloom in a kitchen so gratitude could travel by nose. The steward, puzzled to find the day, had slipped somewhere he could not catalogue, discovered reconciled accounts signed by hands that matched themselves, and, feeling praised by arithmetic, grew for one night less interested in theatre. In the cooper's shed, our quiet friend washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that means to be continued, and wrote the line he prefers. A door remembered itself before sleeping like a roof that has kept its promise. Near midnight a wind tidied the scaffolding's thoughts, and far off a fox footnoted the field in slender grammar. From a path that bends, like a careful question, a single wind chime rehearsed one clean note, as if to say the next doorway would not be timber at all, but custom, a gate policed by habit and patrolled by shame, and passing it would require a different key, the kind you build from how a town dreams of itself when no one is watching. The doorway made of custom revealed itself not as an arch, but as a posture, shoulders squared a touch too sharply at a neighbourhood gate, eyes trained to measure lineage the way a clerk measures columns. Admission here was granted by stories other people told about you, and shame patrolled more faithfully than soldiers. The district was a braided rope of guild houses and old families who preferred their mirrors polished. Misfortune was treated like contagion, and even rain seemed to practice discretion before touching certain roofs. He arrived as a calligrapher's assistant, hired to index genealogies, a useful shadow who carried ink and complimented elbows. His kit was modest and polite, a brush that could write 7 kinds of respect, a thumb-sized stone for persuading latches to practice humility, a silk thread that taught shutters to approve a breeze, a reed that knew how to be forgettable in a gutter. More important than tools was his willingness to be temporarily uninteresting, customs distrust, bright colours. As always, he apprenticed himself to the local grammar. The bathhouse accepted laughter at the second bucket, but frowned at the third. The apothecary weighed mercy into powders for widows, but charged pride a surcharge. The evening bell was rung by a man who added one extra breath for his late wife, and the street learned to pause with him. From these small fidelities he traced the perimeter of the trouble. A widowed dyer, steady hands, an honest eye for indigo, no enemies visible even if one squinted, had been quietly exiled from her contracts by a guild elder who preferred a nephew's weak blue to her truthful one. No decree announced it. Doors simply became too busy. Errands discovered delays, and a social fog settled that made it impolite to notice. Hunger travels faster when it masquerades as etiquette. He did not bring thunder to a place that worshipped porcelain grace. He brought patience with a spine. He borrowed the bathhouse's rhythm. spying water at the hour when tradesmen forgot themselves and spoke in practical nouns. He listened for seams in their sentences. A silk merchant worried about colour consistency. A clerk hiding fear of error beneath a performance of competence. An apprentice who adored gossip but hated cruelty when it tried on fancy clothes. He made himself honest company, carrying the right baskets, agreeing with the right size, becoming a shelf to lean on, while soap did its old diplomacy. I am indexing genealogies, he would say, then ask who in the district kept the clearest memory of repairs, of marriages, of the season when the plums misbehaved. Memory, asked for with courtesy, becomes a coalition. He visited the apothecary with a respectful cough and requested a tincture for ink that dries too slowly, a nonsense that let the old man correct him, smile, then confide that fear dries slower than anything. He took tea behind a fabric stall and admired a bolt of honest blue, letting the shopkeeper feel understood by someone who noticed how good dye holds light like a kept promise. Quietly he set a table where the district could rediscover its better self without losing face. The calligrapher received a commission impossibly flattering to copy ancestral maxims for the Guildhall. He offered the elder 3 drafts in the elder's favourite hand, each panel bearing proverbs about stewardship, so venerable that to object would be to admit one's spine was younger than one's beard. Work shines where hands are clean, read one. Blue that tells the truth is never out of fashion, read another, rescued from a century-old ledger of cloth weights. He found the gossip-loving apprentice who hated cruelty and gave him a task ere could applaud, organise a quality exhibition where bolts would hang anonymously by number, judged by daylight and water, rather than by family name. The clerk who performed competence received an error to conquer. A forged entry about die ratios slipped into a practice ledger so he could discover it, correct it, and feel married to accuracy for the rest of the week. Meanwhile, he practiced the gentle geometry of doors. The dyer's latch learned to stop protesting. A treacherous step was taught quiet manners with oil and gratitude. A gutter that carried secrets away too quickly was slowed by a reed's shy elbow, so the alley would remember blue, the way good memory remembers birthdays. He invited the apothecary to consult on whether certain vats might irritate lungs. Public concern makes an honourable pretext, and the old man, delighted to be useful beyond powders, declared the dyer's process not only safe, but exemplary. People prefer not to quarrel with kindness wearing a physician's apron. Exhibition day arrived, and the district pretended to be studious. Cloths were soaked, wrung, dried, and inspected with the solemnity of judges sworn to daylight. Numbers were read, notes taken, eyebrows consulted. The elder, unaware the stage had been built to rescue him from himself, enjoyed the ceremony. When the anonymous bolt that held light like a faithful promise won by consensus, merchants love to agree when agreement feels like intelligence. The room tasted a rare bliss, pride in standards without the bruise of confession. Only then did numbers become names. A hush that wanted to be shame but decided to be relief passed through the hall. The nephew's die wilted under Water's simplest question, and he became suddenly busy arranging tea. The elder, offered a corridor lined with venerable proverbs, found a sentence he could carry out of the day with dignity. Excellence would henceforth be the family name of every craftsperson in his care. The widow's contracts were restored to honour our ancestors, which is how one honours the future without saying so too loudly. He did not expose, scold, or count victories aloud. He let the district save itself in the grammar it trusted, rituals, proverbs, quality before names. in the days that followed the dyer's shed, learned to hum again. The apothecary stocked a small jar labelled for quick drying courage that was only mint and humour, and the bathhouse permitted laughter at the third bucket whenever good work was mentioned. He wrote the ledger line he loves. A gate remembered hospitality, then erased his softest footprints. He returned a borrowed stool to the precise shadow where it had grown comfortable, straightened a paper screen so the draft would choose mercy, and left a coin beneath the broom, the quiet tithe he pays to early risers. Night gathered the district into its sensible shawl. Along the lane, gossip folded itself into recipes, and recipes into bedtime. Above the roofs, a thin moon practised being a promise. He walked the ridge and heard, from a house that had forgiven a week of pettiness, one wind chime time a careful note. Far down the road, fox tracks stitched the dust with their polite grammar, pointing toward a border town whose peace depended on a bridge that had begun to forget its name, a place where stone would need reminding, and where a rumour about bandits was really a rumour about loneliness waiting to be employed, too. The border town wore its caution like a well-mended coat, practical rather than proud, and at its heart the bridge arched over a river that had learned to negotiate with mountains. Once, travellers greeted the stones by name as if they were elders, but now the arch felt a touch unattended, as though a clerk had misfiled a handful of memories. Rumour insisted bandits haunted the far bank, but rumour, like a child inventing weather, sometimes only wants employment. He arrived as a carpenter's helper with a pouch of pegs and the patient stoop of someone who respects weight. His kit looked ordinary unless you knew how to listen. A brush fluent in a stonemason's hand or a clerk's as needed, a coil of silk that taught shutters good manners, a reed content to pass for river trash, powders that persuaded eyes to blink precisely when discretion asked, sandals that could read the grammar of planks. Before considering the bridge, he apprenticed himself to the town's rhythms. Morning where bakers traded steam for coins, and laughter came 3 breaths after the bell. Noon watching the ferryman's rope debate the current. Dusk learning which dogs argued and which negotiated. He listened to the bridge as one listens to a friend too polite to complain, palm on the parapet to feel the small tremor of neglect, ear for the length of a cart's echo forgetting itself, and found that neglect had settled like courteous dust. A missing dowel here, Mortagon sentimental, a guardhouse ledger more complete in signatures than in inspections. No villains yet, only loneliness assigned tasks beyond its training. He searched for the rumour's scaffolding and found a triangulation of shyness, a miller's boy with a heroic imagination, a retired soldier who missed being necessary, 2 river porters who discovered fear in Large's tips. Their stories, retold and braided, had fattened into bandits. If bandits are employed, he thought, we must hire them back into daylight as something else. He began with the stones. Under the pretext of helping the mason whose knees forecast rain, he reseeded a loosened capstone and snugged the wooden keys that help an arch remember its pact with gravity. He carried usefulness without advertisement, bracing ladders, fetching lime, fetching tea, and men who breathe like metronomes are invited into conversations. From the mason's gentle curses he learned what the council would not admit. Repairs were stalled by a quarrel over who owned which half of the river. Border towns turned geometry into temperament. So he paid people in the currency they preferred. The retired soldier was invited to advise young gatekeepers on how to stand so their backs would not turn to glass before winter. The old man glowed, then softened, then kept watch by the bridge for reasons he could call duty. The miller's boy was given a riddle contest to stage on market day with sesame cakes as prize. His inventions found honest work exercising laughter instead of fear. The porters received an official-looking ledger for courtesies performed, tallying each time they ferried elderly feet across the shallows when carts made the bridge jealous. Men who keep ledgers often end up keeping promises. Then he tuned the day itself. A puppet troupe happened to set its stage by the guardhouse at the hour officials usually rehearsed suspicion. A play about a bridge relearning its name drew children to the parapet, and where children find shadows interesting, shadows forget to be sinister. A tea seller who liked narrows parked her kettle where the arch pinched the wind into a humming note. Her cup sounded like patience. He wrote 3 letters in 3 correct hands, one from a clerk across the river, requesting a joint inspection so repairs may credit both jurisdictions with wisdom, one from the mason praising the retired soldiers' council, as if drawn from the bridge's own ribs, and one from the ferryman proposing a brief toll holiday during market week to encourage commerce to prefer the bridge to rumour. Papers that make sense in someone else's handwriting travel well. He practiced the craft's old hospitalities, oil for the hinge that had cultivated a grudge, a wedge beneath the board that spoke at the worst time, a coin under the broom to bless the dawn worker who would sweep his footprints away. On the far bank, he found where loneliness wore a face, 3 boys in the broken watch shed playing bandit, because no one remembered to employ their afternoons. He offered rope work and a story about knots that rescue carts from embarrassment. "Real bandits," he confided, "hate the smell of tar and rope burn, 2 perfumes of honest usefulness." By evening, they were apprenticed to the ferrymen, proud of blisters that named them. It took a day longer to locate the rumour's heart, a caravan master who preferred the ferry because his arrangement subtracted from weights in a way the bridge could not overlook. Theft requires privacy. Bridges are built to admit witnesses. Rather than corner him into anger, he furnished the caravan with polite inconveniences, a mule throwing a shoe exactly when the puppet's interlude demanded applause, a ferryman's rope needing repair, while 4 neighbours smiled and offered opinions, a cheerful monk declaring a saint's day on which bridges were known to bless wheels with fewer splinters. In 3 market cycles, the caravan master converted to stone. No accusation, only arithmetic that kept its temper. The ledger of courtesies fattened. The retired soldier's stance taught calm weight to young eyes. The miller's boy became famous for riddles that ended in kindness. The porter's margins grew notes, carried Mrs. Junn. She laughed. That anchored future stories against fear. Inspection day came with 2 counsels, one from each bank, wearing their best prudence. He set down his hammer and stood where good work usually stands, a half step back, thumb on a nail's head to check its mood. The mason offered a list of repairs done and a schedule for another agreeable century. The retired soldier, glowing without theatre, commended the novices for leaning on the parapet without teaching it resentment. The ferrymen, smiling like men with legitimate blisters, escorted dignitaries to mid-span so both sets of shoes could agree on a sound. A puppet popped up and bowed. Children clapped because the faces looked suspiciously familiar, and the officials accepted the courtesy of being understood. The council signed a joint pledge. Stone prefers plural signatures, and the town exhaled. That evening, the bridge listened to the river the way old friends do when they remember something kinder than pride. He washed his brush until it recalled only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that promises gentleness tomorrow, and wrote the ledger line he favours, "A bridge remembered its name." Deprived of employment, the rumour found work as a festival story about children and stones conspiring to civilize adults. Night walked the river with unhurried feet. A fox tested the bank and rode a thin line of grammar toward the farther roads. Above the fields, a single wind chime waited for a breeze it trusted, and somewhere past the bend, beneath a moon practicing patience, a courier rode with news of a lord who used silence like a blade, drawing maps with it, a weather that would soon ask him to teach quietness a different vocation. He ruled from a hill the mist visited first, as if rumours preferred higher ground, and even birds altered their grammar when crossing his eaves. He prized a stillness that was not peace, but pressure, the kind that flattens talk into obedience and teaches doors to forget how to breathe. Officials admired his maps because they were clean. Villages snipped into squares, rivers sharpened into arrows. But the squares did not hold fields, and the arrows did not hear water. So he came dressed as a surveyor's clerk with ink on his sleeve, and the posture of one who measures first and argues never, carrying a modest kit whose real purpose hid in manners. A brush fluent in bureaucratic compliments, a coil of silk that taught shutters to speak in whispers, a reed content to pass as yesterday's river, patient powders that persuaded eyes to blink when honesty needed a heartbeat, sandals that knew which floors stored thunder and which remembered lullabies. Before approaching the hill, he apprenticed his patience to the local weather, the fishmonger weighing in a rhythm that had once been chatter and now sounded like swallowed thoughts. The votive rack at the shrine too tidy for comfort, as if wishes feared touching one another. The dusk bell striking exactly, almost cruelly, on time, as though mercy were a rounding error. He listened to silence not for the kindness it sometimes offers, but for the bruises it can hide. The clerk's careful stutter where laughter once began. The child who watched men, the way strays watch boots. The widow folding rice paper with a reverence usually reserved for the dead and for documents. The steward presided over listening tribunals where citizens might speak, provided they first proved they had nothing worth saying. The man's genius was to make fear polite. The craft decided to hire silence back into a better profession. He began by changing what quiet meant in 3 small rooms. Small. In the temple kitchen he rearranged the shelves so pots ceased complaining when lifted. The hush that followed sounded like competence rather than intimidation. In the guardhouse he oiled the hinge that added an unkind syllable to every entrance. Without that syllable, greetings survived the door. In the clerk's office he left a habit behind. At day's end, the final line must be written in large, generous characters. 3 words only, accounts reconcile themselves. So the last sound the room heard was calm. These were not repairs so much as redefinitions. Then he borrowed the steward's vanity, every tyrant keeps one, and wrote, in the steward's tidy hand, a circular praising measured speech and the eloquence of order, sliding it into the stack that would be signed without reading. It instructed all district officers to hold intervals of useful quiet, 15 breaths each hour, in which ledgers were shut and clerks stood by windows to notice small misalignments of mercy. A warped step, a frayed rope, a rumour needing less salt. The steward believed he had invented it. The officers believed they were permitted. The town discovered that silence could be a workshop for noticing rather than a penalty box for feeling. Next, he hired sound to perform one precise kindness. The Lord's favourite court had been tuned to hum. Channels beneath the flagstones seized wind and held it on a single taut note that made men careful to the point of stone. At dusk, when the hill practised longer thoughts, he slipped under the grating with oil and gratitude and loosened one brace by the width of a kindness. Morning woke, the note an octave lower, disciplined still but breathable, and courtiers felt taller without understanding why. Tall men confessed logistics more readily than loyalty. He began to plant pauses where they would prosper. In the scriptorium, he traded a reed of his for a cracked pen, returned at noon with it repaired and a brief order from the steward that once each hour scribes should read aloud what they had written. Hearing changed sentences, flourishes that sounded foolish, melted, petty cruelties stumbled, and the script turned into a mirror rather than a weapon. A young copyist, ears red, with the shock of disliking his own meanness, began to edit toward clarity, and clarity is expensive for tyranny. He befriended the gardener by knowing the names of moss. Together they adjusted the rake's cadence so the gravel paths whispered instead of hissed, and visitors found, to their surprise, that they could hear their thoughts without fear. He found a seamstress whose hands could mend arrogance like cloth, and asked her to alter the steward's sleeve, so each signature required a slower gesture. Compelled to breathe between strokes, the steward began to feel the weight his hand had practiced ignoring. He invited the gate captains to a posture lesson taught by a retired soldier who had learned patience from bridges. In the very court where the Lord's silence performed itself, the soldier showed them how to stand so the hum settled into their spines rather than into their fists. They slept better. Rested men contradict orders less rudely and more successfully. Meanwhile, he tuned the town. A circular, again in the steward's excellent hand, announced an hour of neighbourliness when scales would be checked in public and compliments accepted as currency. Noise at that hour sounded like fairness, and the informers could not report fairness without describing its beauty. A tea house premiered readings of receipts, clerks reciting clean arithmetic with the pride of poets. The applause taught secret taxes to dread daylight. Children painted small crane stones and left them on thresholds formerly stamped by silence. Doorways felt accompanied. He altered nothing essential, if by essential we mean statutes. He altered meanings, which is the deeper substance. Inevitably, silence tried to reclaim its trade. A proclamation required petitions to be delivered in perfect quiet, so the Lord may hear the purity of necessity. He answered with obedience that subverted fear. In the steward's hand, symmetrical and mild, a petition proposed a house of quiet repairs, where citizens might bring objects that made needless noise, hinges with grudges, boards with complaints, gates that insisted on finishing every sentence. Purity, the petition reasoned, prefers tools that do not shout. Pleased with his own consistency, the Lord agreed. The room opened, and people arrived carrying the tyrant's metaphors in their arms. Hinge by hinge, board by board, the town rehearsed a different silence, the useful kind that lets speech stand taller. The steward, warmed by approval for his initiative, expanded the program. A temple novice, whose eyebrows were already practicing wisdom, kept the ledger. In the margins he wrote benedictions, door breathes, step forgives, window consents to wind. The book became civics in camouflage. At length the Lord noticed his maps had grown eyebrows, squares annotated with market pause delights, arrows marked with rests where tea houses read receipts. He walked the courtyard at noon and wondered why the hum felt like a friend instead of a threat. Our quiet clerk, kneeling to help the gardener persuade a reluctant bamboo, heard the Lord's steps pass without their usual brittle echo. He attempted no conversion. He practiced maintenance. The steward's sleeve continued to slow signatures. The scribes kept their reading hour. The captain's posture turned rumour into rest. The house of quiet repairs filled with the music of uncomplaining joints. He washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that means gentleness tomorrow, and wrote his favourite ledger line, silence changed employment. Night moved down the hill like a robe, learning grace. In the lane, children stacked crane stones into a little lighthouse for listening. Far past the last watchfire, a fox stitched the dust with narrow grammar toward hinterlands, where thunder had rehired itself as history. And somewhere ahead, in a pass that pinched wind into sharp opinions, a single wind chime waited, ready to choose one precise, merciful note. The pass pinched the wind into a sharp opinion and taught the pines to speak in cursive, and travellers slowed there without admitting the mountain had negotiated them into humility. Beyond it, the plain rehearsed thunder, as if history were a drumline, banners waking early, armour practising blunt grammar, couriers persuading horses to believe in urgency. He entered as a rope merchant with a pack anyone could understand, coils that smelled of tar and fresh patience, a wooden gauge for knots, a ledger of lengths kept in the candid hand of an honest uncle. His true kit lived, as always, in smaller pockets, a brush fluent in 6 bureaucratic dialects and 1 farmer's, a silk comma that coaxed shudders into good manners, a reed that could pass for yesterday in any stream, powders that invited eyes to blink at the exact moment mercy needed a step, sandals that remembered which gravel liked to gossip. First, he apprenticed himself to the passer's biography, where frost lingered after the day remembered itself, which stone held the echo of hooves for 2 extra heartbeats, how the gorge taught voices to overestimate their own importance. The wind chime he had been courting from afar hung beneath the eave of an inn that preferred to apologise with soup. From its patient note, he learned what the mountain could not say by itself. 2 lords would meet on the plain, each convinced the other required reminding. Scouts counted campfires like grudges, and both sides had retained the same sly artisan of finales, a knife that prided itself on fast decisions. If that blade made itself memorable at parley, the mountain would be asked to memorize a century of noise. He studied the inn as one studies steam. Bowls stacked in 12s, because 12s comfort anxious hands, a daughter who hummed when the salt felt undecided, a limping boy who knew which traveller deserved the better room, because gratitude changes the corners of the eyes. The chime chose its note only when doors behaved. He listened for which doors needed reminding. He rented a corner and mended the inn's ropes like any citizen of usefulness, and in that borrowed citizenship overheard rumour practising. The assassin wore a northern patch, but oiled hinges with a Rivertown dialect. His hand had a musician's patience, not a soldier's boredom. He tipped, like a man rehearsing modesty rather than living inside it. He never hunted men. He hunted the outline of necessity and trimmed it until it could be folded and put away. He began by giving the pass a better story. Signal racks were tightened so fire would not splutter into panic. Snowpots hung at the height where steam becomes an orderly citizen. A tattling step received a wedge and a blessing. He borrowed a festival from an unguarded calendar, a ceremony of bridges to honour ropes and spans, and the craft by which one shore trusts another. Children were deputized as judges of knots. The limping boy presided with a wooden mallet, like a delighted little magistrate. Word of harmless precision travels fast. Even wary men enjoy being admired for tying something that holds. The parley was scheduled for the noon. The mountain considers dignified. That morning he walked the last bends as if he were practising how to be lost, carrying a coil tied with a novice's misbehaving knot, the kind an assassin's eye cannot resist correcting. He let it slip near the man whose posture tried to be careless and accepted a gentle scolding wrapped around perfect fingers. In that brief lesson, he measured reach, breath, and gaze, how the man counted exits while praising rope. He thanked him with the humility owed to teachers, and tucked into the man's sleeve, when the sleeve asked to feel significant, a folded receipt acknowledging the return of a blade borrowed from the quartermaster. The quartermaster's hand, obligingly precise, had been his own the night before. Men praised by a proverb copied in their script discover themselves to be tidy. Pride, whispered to kindly, becomes a key ring. A paper like that wants to find itself where persuasion is hungry. Discovering the receipt, the assassin must choose between two dignities: return a blade he had not borrowed and be delayed by decency, or hide a document already telling the room a story about him. While that seed rooted, he rearranged the parley so catastrophe would feel unfashionable. At his urging, the innkeeper's daughter rehung the wind chime in the crossroads pavilion at a height that made sound behave like breathing. The rope festival gave reason for children to swarm the eaves with competitions. Neatest coil, knot shaped like a sparrow's foot, so any blade in the rafters would acquire witnesses not of valour but of childhood. He drafted, in the southern clerk's impeccable hand, a mutual audit of escorts, a preposterously courteous ritual requiring both retinues to exchange lists of names and positions, so honour may be thanked correctly afterward. Proud competence answered in kind. The choreography reduced shadows and increased accounting. He whispered to the retired soldier every pass keeps, to demonstrate a stance that left no gaps behind the principles. The old bridge friend, grateful to instruct men half his age, made a spectacle of calm. And because an assassin thrives where furniture is ignored, he honoured the furniture. Oil for the pavilion's primary beam, gratitude pressed into the grain until the wood remembered its vocation. Mats shifted so the seam that wants to trip pride rested under courtesy. Stumbling invents thunder. At noon, the lords arrived, bearing their versions of weather, courtiers breathing like men who distrust their own ribs. He let the wind chime, normalize listening, while the audit, ridiculous and thus irresistible, found two names that liked to hide: a smuggled page whose hands had learned steel, and a musician whose fingers were too fond of edges. Receipts in their sleeves, gifts from a quartermaster newly married to neatness, asked their impulses to slow. A retainer, confused into honesty by the paperwork's clarity, proposed that our honoured helpers of sound and blade sit at the rope judging while elders spoke. Vocation that requires two visible hands is a wise invention. The lords, feeling the day lean toward remembering restraint instead of theatrics, surrendered to dignity's easiest trick, allowing procedures to be praised. Their sentences began to resemble maps that had learned to hear water. He said nothing quotable. He added pauses where the mountain approved. When tempers lifted like startled birds, the chime reminded them that breath is a treaty. The assassin, finding no moment that flattered his profession, applauded a child's bowline instead, and to his surprise, corrected a granny knot with tenderness. The day hired him as an uncle and paid him with an exhale he had not known he missed. At dusk the banners folded themselves without composing myth. He washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled the silk into the comma that means to be continued, and wrote the ledger line he loves. Thunder grew bored. The pass relaxed shoulder by shoulder. The inn stacked away its festival bowls. The limping boy tapped his wooden mallet and adjourned court until tomorrow. Down in the dust, a fox stitched its neat grammar toward the coast, where rumours were said to teach ships which ports are homesick, and somewhere on a dune that knows how to hold footprints without keeping them. A single wind chime chose one clear note, not warning, not victory, only a promise that the next door would swing on customs older than any lord, a door made of tide and gossip and the long patience of harbours. The coast received him with the long, even breath of the tide, that patient rhythm by which harbours become customs long before officials arrive with stamps. Gulls scribbled their untidy shorthand across the morning, while junks and coastal boats practiced the etiquette of wakes, each ripple bowing courteously to the next. Ports keep their own grammar of rumour, salt on the tongue, coin in the palm, secrets travelling in baskets of dried fish. And here the talk had varnished itself into a noble word. Security. A magistrate, newly polished by promotion and eager to wring polish from the docks, had announced an audit of loyalties. Nobody could define the crime precisely, which is how crimes manage to harvest the innocent. Beneath the tide line, the trouble was older and simpler, a smuggling ring wearing borrowed temple colours, ledgers fluent into arithmetics, and a handful of bullies calling themselves inspectors so they could tax courage. He arrived as a rope merchant's clerk who knew how to splice honesty back into tired hawsers. His visible kit offered nothing to discuss: a mallet, a fid, a basket of tar that made shirts confess who they had hugged, while his quieter pockets held the instruments of proportion: a brush that could sign a receipt like a harbour master or a novice scribe, a reed content to be mistaken for seaweed, a silk comma that coaxed shutters to approve a breeze, powders that invited eyes to blink at courteous moments, sandals that could read which planks gossiped when moonlight was their only audience. He apprenticed his attention to the harbour's small proprieties, how the tide kissed the pilings, the breaths between bell and shout, the winch that snored, the row of lanterns that wanted trimming sooner than their neighbours, the dogs who could tell an honest sack of rice from a dishonest one by what a handler's shoulders admitted. He befriended the cooper by returning a stave with a compliment about its grain. He pleased the fishwives by carrying baskets without asking the price of news. He made the scullery boy laugh by calling tar the ocean's handwriting lesson. As the port introduced its habits like relatives, the friction points offered their names: a shrine warehouse whose accounts were cleaner at noon than at moonrise, a private jetty with opinions about taxes, a lighthouse whose keeper was devout about his lamp and lonely enough to love anyone who polished brass without making it weep. The magistrate's audit organised itself around spectacle: announcements nailed to posts, seals performing competence, little parades of certainty, and ignored the way the tide teaches humility. So he hired the tide back into management. He began by making the docks grateful for their own noises. Hinges with grudges received oil. A tattling plank learned discretion via wedge and thank you. The bell rope tuned itself to the modest pitch fisherman trust. The quiet that followed sounded like discipline rather than fear, and men who hear that music treat one another more gently. He then borrowed a ceremony from a coastline that would not mind the theft, a festival of knots and lamps, allegedly venerable, honouring the two crafts that keep nights from becoming arguments. Children were sworn in as judges of coils. Sailors' wives became guardians of lampwicks. The lighthouse keeper presided with a vocabulary for dignity that did not require scolding. While everyone rehearsed heritage, he let paper do what paper does best when guided by mercy: turn courage into procedure. In the magistrate's own tidy hand, politely borrowed by compliment, he drafted a circular: all sacred stores to be audited at dawn by paired hands, one temple, one fisherman, so that rice may pass the day without suspicion. theft finds it difficult to keep a straight face under public arithmetic. In the harbour master's easy script, he added a notice of tide window docking, a schedule that innocently discouraged certain boats from meeting certain shadows. Meanwhile, he made friends where loneliness hired itself out as mischief. The lighthouse keeper, given a new brass cloth and a story about distant lamps, confessed his fear that fog would make him irrelevant. Fog, our quiet clerk told him, polishing glass with the respect owed elders, is only the coast deciding to whisper. Lamps exist for that. The man glowed, and in glowing agreed to keep a ledger of unusual lights, 3 short flashes meaning inspection at the private jetty, 2 long sighs meaning unexpected cargo where prayers ride piggyback. The scullery boy, nimble and loyal to anyone who treated him as a citizen, learned a game of counting crates by the way sailors joked. Jokes that tried too hard earned a pinprick in the warehouse wall, a tiny constellation legible to those who read weather inside wood. The cooper, whose circle teaches barrels honesty, tied a minute knot beneath his hoops. Any cask without that true circle would be invited to explain itself. He did not chase the ring that borrowed temple colours. He starved it of its favourite hours. Dawn tallies taught sacred rice to remain sacred when fishermen watched it learn to be breakfast. Tide windows rearranged clandestine rendezvous into awkward errands. An inspector with a taste for bullying discovered himself applauded for enforcing rules, and to his own surprise, applause made his cruelty shy. On the night the ring meant to float a shipment out disguised as lamp oil, the lighthouse threw the wrong right light, a steady beam where smugglers expected the old keeper's occasional sigh. The beam revealed 2 boats practicing discreet clumsiness at the private jetty. Discretion is allergic to light, and the boats became ordinary very quickly. The harbour master, finding that procedure had placed heroism within reach, approached with a ledger rather than a sword and asked with the bewildering authority of a man confident in columns which lamp the oil sought to honour. One boat chose one temple, the other another. The contradiction of saints made everyone practical. The casks showed their honest hoops, save 3 that had learned a dishonest circle. Under inspection by a woman whose lamps never smoked, they admitted they held not oil, but arithmetic. Twin ledgers, bound inside staves, as if wood could keep secrets from trees. The books did not shout. They shrugged in ink and let the harbour read how fear had hired itself to profit. He arrested no one. He arranged a day in which guilt preferred to retire. The magistrate arrived with seals and discovered them unnecessary, accepted the port's compliment that his audit had succeeded splendidly, and signed in his own beautiful hand a set of rules he had not written. Dawn tallies, paired hands, lamps as witnesses, tide as calendar. People clapped as though common sense were a visiting troupe of acrobats, and perhaps it was. He washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that promises gentleness tomorrow, and wrote the ledger line he favours. Cargo learned to tell the truth. The harbour slept with steadier breath. On the sand below the lighthouse, foxprint stitched a brief sentence toward the dunes, and vanished where wind prefers to keep a secret. Gulls, satisfied with the day's arithmetic, argued about fish with less bitterness. Far out, a fishing boat lifted its lamp twice, the keeper's new code, for I see you, and somewhere inland, where river becomes road, and road becomes rumour, a single wind chime chose a note that sounded like canvas beginning to fill, suggesting the next door would open not in a town at all, but within a moving house of wood and wind, where discipline is a song and pride, if it survives, must learn to work for ropes. The moving house of wood and wind received him with a creak that sounded like a polite bow. Ropes hummed their old work song along the gunwales, and the sail breathed as if it had been rehearsing all winter for this one considerate day. Ships collect rumours the way eaves collect dew, quietly without asking, and on this deck the word was pirates, though the water itself preferred a simpler tale. A handful of clever men with small boats and quick nights, and a magistrate ashore who found it useful to keep danger blurry. He came aboard as a rope buyer's nephew, a stoop-backed clerk who recorded splices and measured lines with a wooden gauge that never raised its voice. His kit felt native here, the brush that could sign like a purser or a pilgrim, the silk comma that taught stubborn shutters to approve a breeze, the reed content to masquerade as riverweed in a scupper, powders that asked an eye to blink when mercy required a breath, sandals that could read which planks gossiped under moonlight and which remembered lullabies. Before listening for enemies, he apprenticed himself to the ship's small biographies, because every vessel keeps them close, the block that complains 2 heartbeats before it yields, the step that accepts a heel only if the heel is honest, the lantern that prefers trimming early on fog days. He paid the deck the courtesy due an elder, palming seams, memorizing the gate a good hull teaches, learning the bell's true hour rather than the one men pretend to keep. The captain, a woman whose hair had learned the grammar of wind, ran her crew with the courtesy of accuracy. She kept 3 ledgers, cargo, rations, and favours owed to weather. "We are a school," she told no one in particular, "and the ocean invigilates." He liked the plain vanity of that. The mission, when it declared itself, was not to catch pirates but to unhire them by stealing the excuse that fed them. A certain merchant house, fat with its own importance, underweight at the quay and overweight at sea, minting enemies in the difference, fishermen feeling cheated by arithmetic with soft edges, had been persuaded toward nocturnal rectifications now renamed crime. If cargo could be taught to tell the truth in transit, perhaps knives would remember how to stay sheathed. He began with the ship's memory. He tuned the watch, not by adding eyes, but by giving them a better song. A young helmsman who hummed when uncertain was placed on midnight, where humming is a weather report. A taciturn boatswain who loved knots more than praise was asked to teach 3 honest splices at dawn. The cook, a philosopher of boiling, agreed to strike a pan when wind sharpened 1 note thinner than the sail preferred. Slowly the deck learned a conversation in which panic received fewer invitations. He borrowed a ritual from a mountain bridge, a weighing chorus. At each watch change, 4 voices called the cargo list, while 2 hands touched barrels, 2 touched crates, and the captain chalked the echo on the hatch. Theft dislikes choruses. It prefers solos in dark keys. He befriended the carpenter by admiring a seam that had taught itself patience. In gratitude, the carpenter confessed that a false floor in the aft locker could cradle 5 pretty bundles of arithmetic. "It was here when I shipped," he said, ashamed for the ship rather than himself. The false floor learned humility under a mallet. The bundles discovered daylight's language, which even pride understands. The captain, seeing sums laid out, like fish on a plank, sighed as one who prefers water to rumour. "We will deliver what we carry," she said, and the ribs agreed, in the small way timbers agree. Out on the slate road, other boats practiced mischief under a coin-persuaded moon. He did not sharpen a knife, he sharpened courtesy. A narrow-hooded stern lantern began to speak a code the lighthouse keeper would recognise, 2 small sighs and 1 long, meaning we believe our sums. On nights when the horizon looked argumentative, he paid tithes to coherence, oil for a sulking sheave, a wedge beneath the tattling plank, a coin under the broom for dawn's first sweeping. He drafted, in the harbour master's easy hand a notice that ships using the weighing chorus earn tide window priority at berth. Thieves are allergic to schedules they do not write. Because piracy also hires loneliness, he found the boys in fast boats who thought night was a profession. He met them as a customer for young courage, offering work the sea could applaud, laying reef marks with polished stones that taught moonlight to be honest, tending a thin procession of buoys that blinked in the mathematical kindness the lighthouse had adopted. Real seamanship, he whispered like scandal, is a conspiracy between accuracy and mercy. A few laughed, one or two listened, one tied a bowline that would have made the retired soldier of bridges nod into his sleeve. The sea, which respects restraint, tried him fairly. Near midnight a skiff came braided to rumour, low profile, oars that feared noise, a lamp shaded to resemble modesty. The captain kept her course, refusing the water the theatre it sometimes requests. He stood where the ship makes decisions, beside the bell rope, within reach of the helmsman's humming, and let the watch rehearse its chorus softly, as if practising for later. Cargo names, rice, tea, iron fittings, became a lullaby informing the dark, which temptations had already been counted. A grapnel kissed the rail, and might have written a sentence if the new seam had not remembered courage. The hook glanced off with a sound like a scolded spoon. Powder asked two eyes to blink together. Choreography faltered. The skiff remembered an errand elsewhere. No shout, no chase, only a vessel that agreed with itself so thoroughly that theft felt impolite. He left behind no heroics, only habit. Morning arrived like a draft letter, finding its final words. At the quay, the scales told the same truth as the hatch chalk. Fishermen observed, with the stern pleasure of men with long memories, that sums behaved. Grievances, deprived of their favourite food, shrank and wandered off to search for politics instead. The merchant house, confronted by arithmetic it had hoped to blur, discovered a new motto about transparency and painted it on barrels in a blue that held light like a kept promise. In the evening, the captain read the ledger of favours owed to weather and added a grateful line for wind that had not grown vain. He washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that means gentleness tomorrow, and wrote the entry he loves. A ship kept its word. Night lifted its careful tide. Gulls argued about honourable fish. The lighthouse answered with two small sighs and one long, and beyond the breakwater fox prints stitched their neat grammar along a wet strand that forgot them kindly. Far north, the coast bent toward a city whose roofs know how to carry snow without complaint, where winter teaches people to speak in low temperatures, and a school of mountain patience is famous for asking breath to kneel. In a narrow alley there, under an eave that prefers listening to icicles, a single wind chime waited to time one calm note, inviting a return to those old valleys where names like Iga and Kōga are spoken softly, and where the craft would soon meet scholars bent on turning weather and footfall into a book that could be taught back to the world. Snow had trained the city to lower its voice, and beneath roofs that shouldered their white burdens without complaint, the craft was summoned into a different sort of room. Inkstone rooms, sleeve-conscious rooms, where scholars believed a page could convince a century to sit still. He arrived as a courier for a paper merchant, forgettable except to those who cared how a sheet receives winter breath and which way the grain prefers to lie. From that unremarkable citizenship of errands, he watched the conversation condense, how to catch a moving weather and persuade it to hold still long enough to be sketched. Elders who had trusted chores over oaths were asked to remember. Younger men who had inherited patience like a family tool were asked to name it. Words began trying on their upright shoes, terms for concealment that were not cowardice, for approach that was not rudeness, for leaving no bruise on thresholds that had done nothing wrong. A monk, older now, mathematics tucked in his sleeve and his eyebrows, quietly promoted, argued that any book about their way must behave like a broom rather than a trumpet, sweeping mischief out of methods until only clean fidelities remained. Across the table, a retired retainer who had learned bridges and posture and the trick of standing taller without making others small, held the other edge of the same cloth. If the dangerous parts are not written down, noise will volunteer to write them for you. The room hummed like winter rakes on gravel. He poured tea, slipped wedges under wobbling chairs so ideas could stand without inventing drama, and listened while talk learned its own breath. From that weather of thought, a few volumes settled into being. Manuals that sounded like a conversation between a carpenter and a librarian. They listed doors and the courtesies that keep them dignified. They measured darkness, not as romance, but as material. They sorted powders by the request they make of eyes. Close for a breath, look aside. Allow tears the wind can take credit for. They drew knots without swagger, not for legend, but so roofs would go on trusting ropes. They spoke of provinces by temperament, hills that teach knees humility, fogs that reward patience, towns where dogs keep better books than men. They recorded signals disguised as housework, sandals turned outward, meaning be ready, a chrysanthemum in a ledger corner, meaning this guest will return, a reed resting on a sill, meaning let the night finish thinking. Much later, readers born elsewhere would quarrel over these books, as if jurisdiction could be bound in thread. Some would call them pure memory, others theatre with a tidy spine. He did not argue. He recognized the fragrance, ink over rice glue, a promise to keep mischief small, and helped copy in a hand that refused to gossip. Scholars asked their favourite question: where does myth begin? He set his brush down and answered by pointing gently to the room itself. Myth begins when a technique earns a pose. The cure is to practice until the pose gets bored and leaves. Another question arrived, dutiful as a second bell. Is this art the child of chaos or of order? He thought of market towns that chose boredom as their sovereign, bridges that remembered their names, granaries that coached rice through winter without scandal, and spoke as softly as a broom. It is born of respect, first for thresholds, then for tomorrow. He offered no romance of vanishing. He described instead the labour of leaving rooms at the same emotional temperature one found them, or a degree kinder if time allowed. The pens nodded, perhaps a little disappointed that heroism had been measured into housekeeping, then learned to admire that discipline. Outside, the city rehearsed being a book of itself. Snow margins, footprints for annotations, alleys remembering who hurried and when. He walked the ridge above the scholars' quarter and read the roofs as paragraphs, where weight was well distributed, where an apology of broomwork waited for dawn, where a single eave nursed a sulky icicle because a beam had not been thanked with oil. Fox prints stitched their narrow grammar along a canal practicing ice. Beneath an eave that listened more than it dripped, a wind chime waited for the breath in which thought becomes decision. The manuals quickened something dangerous and delicate, reputation. Woodblock artists arrived with small knives and a weakness for silhouettes. Theatre men sniffed a posture the audience might learn to covet. He knew what happens when labour grows a shadow wider than its ladder. The shadow will start lecturing the ladder. So he spent his evenings in less interesting rooms, guardhouses, kitchens, sheds, reminding the younger hands that their first allegiance was to tomorrow's unremarkable dawn. He told them about the hinge that forgot to complain because someone remembered to thank it, about the day thunder grew bored and left a pass as quietly as it came, about a bridge that reclaimed its name by lending courage to children. Each story ended, not in triumph, but maintenance. Some boys listened with the impatience of strong legs, others with the relief of being spared costumes they were not ready to wear. In the scholars' rooms, a debate folded itself neatly. Should disguises be written as wardrobes or as manners? He spoke for manners. If you wear a porter's day, he said, you owe it a good ending. A seamstress, with wind-accurate fingers, grey now, tireless still, seconded the motion by mending a scholar's sleeve, so his arm learned a kinder gesture. In that small correction, a chapter discovered its moral. Winter softened by shy degrees. The books advanced like careful roofs, beam by beam, with pauses for honesty, and somewhere a preface decided that teaching exists not to mint legends but to prevent widows. He washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that promises gentleness tomorrow, and closed the ledger he keeps only in his head with the line he returns to when days pretend to be complicated. Attention is mercy, practiced until it becomes weather. On a night like that, the city seemed to approve, lanterns breathing evenly, bells choosing restraint over spectacle. He stepped into the alley where the wind chime had been patient all season, and as if cued by the hush, it offered one clean note, not a summary, a hinge. The sound opened a door toward popular memory, prints and stages and tavern songs, where silhouettes might upstage rooftops, and beyond that door waited another, carved from a newer wood. The century when strangers with foreign alphabets would ask what the craft had been for, and whether its quiet could survive a world that prefers to shout. Misunderstandings arrive the way fog does, honest about being fog and yet determined to borrow the shapes of trees. And so he watched with the tolerant sorrow of a caretaker as popular memory dressed the craft in a costume handsomer than chores and louder than patience, figures sewn from lanterns swallowing black, leaping like punctuation across roofs, knives streaking like meteors as if endings were a kind of weather. The elders, who had tutored him in the grammar of hinges and the small ethics of thresholds, smiled with weathered amusement because they knew the night of working nights is not theatre ink, but the forgiving indigo that loves moonlight, the browns that speak politely with mud, the quilted greys that make peace with walls. They knew the famous little iron stars were not thunder, but commas, thrown to teach a sentence to hesitate, to change the cadence of pursuit. They knew powders were not curses but courteous petitions to the eyes for the gift of a blink. They knew ropes were not stage applause but conversations with height. So he dusted the myths with housekeeping. No, the craft did not keep a ledger of murders. It kept company with outcomes, escorting a day back toward the ordinary, persuading a convoy to arrive one whisper later, giving rice the dignity of remaining rice. No, the work was not forever outlaw. In many houses it drank tea with duty, guarding warehouses where fire liked to make new friends, guiding ambassadors through evenings when pride practiced the wrong steps, standing a shift atop walls to convince darkness to mind its manners. No, the craft was never only male. Women carried its instruments inside the citizenship of usefulness. Midwives who knew the schedules of panic and mercy, seamstresses who could mend an alibi without breaking a person, merchants who listened to prices the way monks listen to breath. No, the craft did not invent invisibility, it invented belonging. A porter's stoop, a pilgrim's upward gaze, a clerk's sincere boredom. These were its true cloaks, woven from manners rather than moons. And no, legend, it did not live forever in storm. Under long peace, it learned humblier chores, watching for sparks before they learned ambition, escorting secrets determined to remain kind, filing the city's anxieties into drawers that closed softly. He polished other errors with the rag of recollection. The notion that every technique was a duel with gravity, when the art has always been to ask the stairs for permission. The fable that poisons solve impatience, when deeper practice shows impatience the door and lets it leave. The boast that one valley owned wisdom, when hills taught in different dialects and the sea offered its own proverbs about rope. He remembered the winter manuals smelling of rice and restraint, how they measured tools by courtesy rather than cleverness, the brush that writes 5 hands so doors needn't argue, the reed that ferries a sentence beneath a busy surface, the coil of silk that coaxes a shudder toward a kinder decisions. And he remembered the ledger line that had steadied him through louder seasons. Attention is mercy, practiced until it becomes weather. How far that stands from the thirst for spectacle that makes heroes noisy and villains glamorous. Still, he refused to scold the silhouettes taverns and stages adored. He asked them gently to bow to the chores that kept them from lying. He told a boy dazzled by woodblock thunder about a bridge that remembered its name when children became the judges of knots. He told a girl secretly practicing throws that the kindest aim is often for the hour rather than the body. Delay the cruelty, hire a festival, bribe a hinge with oil and gratitude. He told skeptics that myths are innocent when they remember their manners, and that even a costume can earn honesty by carrying a broom. In quieter corners, he admitted what cannot be laundered entirely clean. Some nights were rough, sometimes a candle had to be pinched out before it taught the house to burn, but even then, the craft tried to leave the room at the same emotional temperature it had found it, or a degree kinder if time would bend. Does that sound like magic? Perhaps the smallest kind. The magic of arriving, listening, and letting floorboards keep their secrets. Outside the world rehearsed louder answers. Foreign eyes came with unfamiliar alphabets and borrowed whatever could be admired at a distance. A pose here, a tool there, a rumour with posture. Theatre men taught shadows to do what chores had never asked for. Printers taught silhouettes to multiply. He did not chase them. He stood at the stage's cool edge and hummed like a kettle, content with its own steam, hoping an audience might, now and then, hear the hinge behind the flourish, snow-thinned to a scrim of careful drizzle. Along the canal, the fox stitched its narrow grammar toward a district of paper moons and playhouses where songs would dress patience in armour and instruct rooftops to leap. He washed his brush until it remembered only its hairs, coiled his silk into the comma that promises gentleness tomorrow, and closed his invisible ledger on a line that will always need rewriting. Legend bowed to housekeeping. Somewhere ahead, beyond a curtain convinced it was a horizon, a single wind chime waited in the rafters, timing one clean note to teach painted night how to listen before the orchestra of silhouettes began. Stages fell in love with a silhouette because it could travel farther than a face, and in the lantern-bright quarters he found his reflection doing things he had never taught it to do, wearing colours he would never waste time arguing against. On kabuki nights, the painted moon stooped low, while a figure in impossible black, blacker than any honest alley, skimmed balconies, as if gravity were a rumour, bunraku hands gave foxtail bows that made secrets bow too, and woodblock knives carved paper into mid-air, so that wherever the print wandered, a whisper followed like a trained sparrow. Soon the pose had a passport. Edo Alley fans snapped into shuriken with a gasp. Meiji streets threaded with telegraph wire sold chapbooks that promised midnight audacity to clerks tired of balancing columns. Cinema arrived with quick breath and taught the silhouette to run farther than a stage permits. Radio slipped a blade into sound's pocket. Pulp magazines laid lattices of rooftops no city had truly owned. Elsewhere, overseas that prefer cargo to reputation, the figure learned foreign grammars, a trench coat shadow under a rain that mispronounced itself, a poster that married moonlight to a promise louder than sleep, a skyline rehearsing leaps in tongues that traded paper for neon. Sometimes the costume bowed toward the old modesty, indigo that forgives lanterns, a body moving like punctuation that changes a sentence without breaking it. Often it chose spectacle, capes where rope would have sufficed, explosions where a hinge could have been thanked, a duel dragged on to the hour that a well-placed rumour might have saved with less memory of violence. He watched without bitterness. Stories are ways a people talk to themselves, and some evenings a people need the bigger drum. Still, he kept a broom folded in his sleeve, and used it whenever the page drifted within reach. In scripts he whispered that a star tossed at a lamp is not a meteor, but a comma begging a breath. To a director he nudged the ethics of exits. Leave the room as gentle as you found it, even if the orchestra has brass to spend. To an animator he lent a ledger of small fidelities, so ink would remember to oil a hinge, square a bowl, thank a beam. Not every borrowed manner survived the sea. In one city, blades learned to shout. In another, a mask forgot. It was meant to help the face listen. Debates travelled with the merchandise. Scholars argued whether popular memory had taught a lie to walk upright or simply gave chores their theatre. Artists insisted exaggeration is how the heart remembers. Curators tried to separate artifact from affection and discovered that even the cleanest glass grows mist when breath leans near. He judged none of it. He had seen myths and manuals drink from the same cup and both come away steadier. In quiet rooms, without microphones, he admitted another tenderness, shadows. Keep certain children company through corridors daylight does not fully understand. Yet he kept indexing where spectacle had misfiled the point. Bravery in this craft never lived in darkness. It lived in daylight's humdrum mercies, the rumour that empties a square instead of populating it with widows, the schedule that persuades iron to wait while rice goes home, the festival arranged so a knife cannot find its moment. Even on sound stages that preferred thunder, he smuggled, in the weather of chores, a bell rope tuned to human breath, a seam that teaches a sleeve to slow the hand that signs, a market stall whose ledger, read aloud, convinces the scene to prefer fairness. In animation cells he asked for one small error that tells the truth, a porter's scuffed sandal, a pot lid tilted because a child was called away to listen. In comic panels, he asked for a dog that decides not to bark. Viewers, not always knowing why, felt more held. Perhaps that had always been his hope, to escort an audience, softly, almost invisibly, toward a sleep in which doors have good manners and mornings wake unbruised. Still the silhouette multiplied. A boy in the orange of his village learned to speak patience in the dialect of thunder. A tale of betrayal taught forgiveness to readers who did not come expecting that work. Games turned rooftops into arithmetic and asked hands to memorize leaps they would never test against weather. He smiled at these new dialects, noting the moments when they remembered to bow toward the chores. In the long chorus, one quiet line remained legible. Belonging is the finest cloak. Kindness can be tactical without lying to itself. Attention is the only invisibility worth practicing. The night streets shuddered, stages folded their painted horizons, printers washed their blocks until Wood remembered being tree. He washed his brush until it recalled only its hairs, coiled the silk into the comma that promises gentleness tomorrow, and entered the line in the ledger, no one can audit. Legend borrowed its manners. Snow had retreated into a shine like memory. Fox prints stitched their grammar along the canal toward a scholar's ward, debating whether history sleeps better when sung softly. Above, a paper moon tasted rest and decided to keep a little of this world's courtesy. And just at the threshold of hearing, beneath an eave that has learned to listen across centuries, a single wind chime chose one clean note, as if the next door were already swinging open, not toward stages or battles, but into the quieter country of what can be learned and kept, the soft lessons a craft carries into the rooms where we live. Night has come to that soft hour when streets learn whispering and windows carry their small moons from room to room, and after so much walking together, it feels faithful to loosen our pace, to let the craft arrange its own last bow while we listen with unhurried attention. If you place your ear against the long table of this story, you can still hear what kept it sturdy. The ledger written in courtesies, the rope practicing second careers, the brush that spent its cleverness on doors instead of applause, and somewhere behind silhouettes and the theatre of midnight, an older music keeps playing. Hinges that quit complaining because someone remembered oil, a bridge that remembered its name. When children judged knots, rice permitted the dignity of remaining rice because the hour was tuned rather than conquered. He knew, as roofs know snow, that the point was never vanishing but belonging. To borrow a porter's stoop and pay it back with a day returned safely. To wear a pilgrim's upward gaze without stealing the pilgrimage. To let a clerk's tidy boredom become a passport that harms no one. The little iron star, if asked while lanterns drowse, will confess it was never a meteor but a comma, tossed into a sentence so breath could find its manners. The powders will admit they were requests rather than maledictions, invitations for eyes to blink at the exact instant tomorrow required a chance. The ropes will explain, with the humble pride of useful things, that they were always conversations with height, patient negotiations with beams about promises already made. We have kept him company through kitchens that taught arithmetic to roomers, granaries that persuaded law to tell the truth, guardhouses where posture was tuned until fists forgot themselves. We have read weather with midwives and copied patience from seamstresses' wrists. We have heard a courtyard's hum settle one octave lower so men could stand up without stepping on anyone. In ports that loved gossip more than accuracy, we watched lamps and knots renew their old alliance, light as witness, rope as grammar. At sea, we heard the weighing chorus teach cargo to keep its word. On passes, where thunder liked to audition, we saw children with wooden mallets hire the day into restraint. Even in winter rooms where scholars hoarded silence for ink, the craft refused to become a trumpet and asked instead to be a broom, sweeping mischief off the page so the ordinary might pass without bruises. And when stages stitched silhouettes from moonlight, he did not quarrel with them, only ask the costume to bow toward the chores, to thank a beam, to square a bowl, to leave the room at the same emotional temperature it was found, or a degree kinder if the scene allowed. Perhaps that is the quiet thesis smuggled inside his errands. that attention, practiced until it kneels into humility, becomes a kind of weather under which villagers breathe easier. The ledger he keeps, where no one can audit it, carries the entries you now recognise. Thunder grew bored. A bridge remembered its name. Rice remained rice. Cargo told the truth. Silence changed employment. A door remembered itself. Modest lines which, gathered together, compose a country in which fewer widows must learn new arithmetic. When he is asked, as people eventually ask, whether the craft is real or merely a mannered rumour, he smiles the way a lamp smiles at its own glass and declines to argue. Real is the bell rope, tuned to human breath. Real is the step that no longer tattles. Real is the rumour placed like a slender wedge, so 2 proud hours change their minds without losing face. And if someone insists on heroics, he offers them a broom and a hinge and invites them to manufacture an unremarkable dawn. The elders have begun to thin. Roofs remember their names, unaided. A new boy learns to carry water without asking water to clap. A new girl discovers that a ledger read aloud can hush 3 streets. Manuals sleep beneath eaves that prefer listening. Stages fold their painted horizons and dream in lantern-forgiving indigo. The fox prints we have followed for so long reach the dunes and, as always, refuse ownership of the wind. Their grammar breaks into kindness and disappears where sand remembers how to keep a confidence. Overhead, in the patient rafters, where wood has practiced wisdom, a single wind chime times its clear note. The same we have met at every threshold, neither victory nor warning, only a hinge, and if you stand very still, you can feel the house of the world lean open by a breath. Inside waits no throne, no mask, only the old tools laid on their cloth. Brush, reed, coil of silk, powders, sandals that remember which floors like to grumble. He will pick them up in the morning, because mornings prefer to be greeted by people who apologise to floorboards and thank doorways for their patience. For tonight he returns his kit to sleep and sets the room back to its rightful temperature, places the shoes outward by the door for the sake of any hour that might arrive in a hurry, leaves a coin beneath the broom in honour of the hands that will rise early and make us ready for gentleness. Writes in a ledger, nobody will ever read the line that is never truly last. Attention is mercy practiced until it becomes weather. And then he blows out the lamp in a way that lets darkness keep its dignity. If you listen as the wick turns into a small red memory, you will hear the craft's soft answer to centuries of asking, not disappearance, but care. And if sleep chooses to come now, let it find you under that weather, in a house of uncomplaining hinges and bridges that still know their names, while somewhere beyond the last cedar the path bends like a thoughtful question, and night, satisfied with its arithmetic, closes the book without bruising a single page.